Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and the long story of our planet unfolds at a pace gentle enough to keep you company as you wind down. Tonight we'll take a journey not into the far reaches of physics or the mysteries of time, but into something a little closer to home. The home itself, really. Because we're going to explore what Earth was like during the Cenozoic, the age that began after the dinosaurs left the stage and continues right up to the moment you're sitting in now. It's a story stretching across more than 66 million years. A story of mammals stepping out from the shadows, forests stretching across continents, oceans changing their chemistry and currents, and climates swinging from greenhouse warmth to icy breath. And tucked inside that story is also the slow rise of us, humans, who only appeared at the very tail end but carry the whole age in our bones. Before we sink into this journey, I'd like to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? And what's the world like around you right now? Maybe you're curled up with a blanket in the late evening. Maybe you're travelling somewhere. Or maybe it's the early morning and you're using this as a quiet start before the day begins. It's funny, isn't it? To think that wherever you are, the ground beneath you carries traces of the Cenozoic. Whether it's in the form of rocks laid down by ancient seas or fossils of animals that once roamed the land, the age we're about to wander through is still under your feet and overhead in the air you breathe. And just like always, if you find this kind of gentle exploration soothing or helpful, I'd be grateful if you liked the video and maybe subscribed. It helps more people stumble into this little corner of calm science and join us on these long journeys. Now let's begin. The Cenozoic opens with silence. Not complete silence, of course, but a quiet after the storm. A hush after one of the most dramatic events in Earth's history. A massive asteroid struck the planet near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula about 66 million years ago, and with it the Cretaceous ended. The giant reptiles that had ruled the land, sea and sky for so long were suddenly gone, along with countless other creatures. What followed wasn't a reset exactly, but it was a chance for the survivors, mostly small and often overlooked, to step into a world newly cleared of competitors. That new chapter is what we call the Cenozoic, often nicknamed the Age of Mammals, though in truth it's also the age of birds, the age of flowering plants, and in many ways the age of change. When we think about long spans of Earth's history, it's tempting to picture them as fixed or stable, as if once dinosaurs left the scene, mammals simply marched forward toward us. But the reality was far more complex, with climates rising and falling, oceans flooding and retreating, continents drifting and colliding, and entire ecosystems building themselves up only to be reshaped again and again. The Cenozoic wasn't just a stage for mammals to grow bigger, it was a laboratory of constant adjustment, where survival meant flexibility and innovation. Imagine the earliest moments right after the impact. The air would have been thick with dust, soot and aerosols. Sunlight struggled to reach the surface. Plants suffered, and animals that depended on them suffered too. But as months and years passed, the atmosphere cleared, and life began to push forward again. In that recovery, you would have seen small mammals, many of them resembling shrews, opossums or early primates, darting through undergrowth. Birds, which had descended from small feathered dinosaurs, also thrived. Crocodiles, turtles, and other resilient creatures carried on much as they had for millions of years already. The new world was familiar in parts, but also strangely open, filled with ecological opportunities that hadn't existed when massive sauropods and tyrannosaurs dominated the land. Forests began to spread across wide stretches of the planet. In the Paleocene, which was the first slice of the Cenozoic, Earth was warm and humid. Tropical forests reached into latitudes where today you'd find snowy mountains or cold seas. Imagine palm trees and broad-leaved forests growing in places like Greenland or Alaska. That warmth meant ecosystems could be lush almost everywhere, and the creatures that lived there evolved to take advantage. Mammals diversified quickly, experimenting with new shapes and lifestyles. Some grew larger, filling niches once held by dinosaurs. Others stayed small but became more specialised. Early primates appeared, with grasping hands and forward-facing eyes that set the stage for a lineage that would much later include us. The oceans too carried their share of survivors and innovators. Sharks, which had existed for hundreds of millions of years already, continued to dominate the seas. Bony fish diversified further. Marine reptiles like mosasaurs had vanished with the dinosaurs, but other creatures began to fill the gap. Early whales, still with legs and capable of moving on land, began their slow transformation into the fully aquatic giants we know today. Sea life was in flux, but it was also blossoming in new directions. If you'd been able to stand on the shore during those early Cenozoic years, you would have seen coastlines that looked both familiar and alien. Familiar, because waves rolled in, and gull-like birds might have been wheeling overhead. Alien, because the mix of plants along the shore was different. The insects buzzing around them were of species now long gone, and in the distance you might glimpse a group of hoofed mammals that look vaguely like horses but not quite. In every direction, the world was rebuilding itself, reshaping the tapestry that had been torn at the end of the Cretaceous. What makes this beginning so compelling is how quickly change came. In just a few million years, which sounds long but in geological terms is a blink, mammals grew into larger and more diverse forms. Some developed hooves and grazed on soft plants. Others became predators with sharp teeth and strong jaws. Rodents appeared and spread, their gnawing teeth allowing them to exploit seeds and tough vegetation. Bats evolved the ability to fly and navigate by sound. And primates, small and mostly tree-dwelling at first, began their long journey of adaptation and exploration. The climate in this early part of the Cenozoic was not only warm but at times extremely warm. About 55 million years ago, during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, global temperatures spiked even higher, possibly triggered by massive releases of carbon into the atmosphere. Polar regions became nearly subtropical, and forests extended almost to the poles. Crocodiles swam in what is now the Arctic. Imagine a world without ice caps, with lush vegetation in places we associate today with tundra or frozen sea. That warmth had dramatic effects on ecosystems, driving rapid evolution in plants and animals alike. But Earth never sits still for long. As millions of years rolled on, climates began to shift again. Some regions cooled and dried, leading to the spread of grasslands. New landscapes opened, and with them came new ways of life. Grazing animals evolved teeth suited to grinding tough grasses. Predators adapted to chasing prey across open plains, rather than ambushing them in dense forests. Birds, too, grew into remarkable forms, some of them flightless giants that could run down small mammals, others swift hunters that took to the skies. The continents themselves were not fixed in place but kept drifting. South America, for much of the Cenozoic, was isolated like a giant island continent. There it developed unique animals like enormous flightless predatory birds, giant sloths, and armoured mammals related to armadillos. Australia, also isolated, became home to marsupials that filled roles taken by placental mammals elsewhere. Over time, collisions between continents reshaped mountains and altered ocean currents. The rise of the Himalayas, for example, came from India colliding with Asia, and that towering range not only transformed the landscape but also influenced global climate by altering wind and rainfall patterns. The Cenozoic is often described as a story of mammals taking over, but it's equally a story of Earth's climate system experimenting with extremes. There were long warm intervals and sharp coolings, dry expansions of deserts and wet periods when forests marched forward again. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell. Each swing left its imprint in the fossils, in the chemistry of rocks, and in the DNA of species that survived by adjusting. And through all of this, the planet was slowly building toward the world we recognize today. The animals became more familiar, the plants more like those in your garden or local park, the landscapes closer to what you'd see on a globe. But if you had been alive at almost any point in the Cenozoic, you would have noticed differences. Horses, for instance, began tiny dog-sized creatures browsing in forests, nothing like the tall grazers of the plains we know now. Elephants had many odd relatives, some with 4 tusks, some with shovel-like jaws. Whales still carried echoes of their land-dwelling past in their anatomy. Even the apes and early humans that eventually appeared were part of a shifting, branching tree, full of experiments in form and behaviour. It's worth remembering that while we tell this as a story, with a beginning and a path forward, the organisms living at each stage didn't know what was coming. They simply lived, reproduced, and adapted to the world around them. From their perspective, each age was complete and whole, just as ours feels now. The forests of the early Paleocene weren't waiting for grasslands to appear, and the mammoths of the Pleistocene weren't waiting for humans to invent fire. Each moment was its own present, its own now, full of challenges and opportunities. That's the welcome to the Cenozoic. A long breath after catastrophe, a planet reshaping itself, a cast of survivors testing new roles. And from here we'll move deeper into the details, through the lush forests that once covered the world, the strange mammals that roamed them, the oceans that harboured creatures halfway between land and sea, the climates that shifted from sweltering warmth to icy grip, and finally, to the arrival of humans who found themselves in a world already transformed by millions of years of change. When we left off, Earth had just opened the Cenozoic with a kind of quiet resilience, life returning after the extraordinary chaos of the asteroid impact. To step into the earliest part of this age, the Paleocene, is to imagine a world both devastated and full of possibility. The dinosaurs that had thundered across the land for more than 100 million years were gone, except for the winged lineage that lived on as birds. Their absence left behind empty ecological spaces, niches in forests, rivers, oceans and skies that had once been tightly filled. The survivors, many of them small and unassuming, now had room to spread, change and invent new forms of life. The Paleocene began around 66 million years ago and lasted until about 56 million years ago, which sounds like an unimaginably long stretch, but in the history of the planet it was just the opening act of the Cenozoic. Picture a globe without polar ice caps, where warmth reached far toward the poles and where lush forests covered much of the land. Even places that are cold and inhospitable today were, at that time, wrapped in vegetation. In Greenland and Alaska, for instance, forests of broadleaf trees and conifers flourished. The air was thicker with carbon dioxide than it is now, and the greenhouse climate gave the world a deep, humid warmth. On land, the survivors of the extinction included crocodiles, turtles, amphibians, and especially mammals. For more than 100 million years, mammals had mostly lived in the shadows of dinosaurs, literally and figuratively. They had been small, often nocturnal, feeding on insects, seeds, or plants, and they rarely grew larger than a badger. After the extinction, with predators and competitors gone, those same mammals began to spread into new forms. They didn't instantly become giant elephants or bison. At first they remained relatively modest in size, but in just a few million years some grew larger than anything mammalian before them. One of the earliest groups to take advantage were the multituberculates, an order of mammals that had actually coexisted with dinosaurs for tens of millions of years. They had gnawing teeth similar to rodents, though they weren't rodents themselves, and during the Paleocene they thrived, filling roles that range from squirrel-like tree dwellers to beaver-like swimmers. For a time they were among the most successful mammals in history, though they would eventually fade as true rodents evolved and outcompeted them. At the same time, the ancestors of modern groups were branching out. Early primates, for example, appeared in the Paleocene. They were small, lived in trees, and had features like grasping hands and feet, giving them an advantage in navigating forest canopies. From these humble beginnings, the primate lineage would eventually give rise to monkeys, apes and humans. But for now, they were simply small, nocturnal creatures scurrying through the lush Paleocene forests. The predators of this time were not yet cats, dogs or bears. Instead, mammals like creodonts filled the carnivorous roles. These animals are now entirely extinct, but in the Paleocene they were the top land hunters, with sharp teeth and strong jaws. Some were small, others grew larger, and they preyed on the herbivores that were themselves experimenting with new shapes and sizes. Perhaps the strangest looking mammals of the Paleocene were the pantodonts. They were among the first truly large mammals, some reaching the size of modern-day tapirs or small rhinos. They looked ungainly, with heavy bodies and blunt teeth suited for chewing plants, and though they weren't especially fast or graceful, they represented one of the first attempts by mammals to occupy the large herbivore niche that dinosaurs had once dominated. The plant world of the Paleocene was equally important. Flowering plants, which had appeared back in the Cretaceous, now spread more widely. Dense forests covered much of the land, and palms, magnolias and many other broadleaf plants thrived in the warmth. Without polar ice, sea levels were higher, coastlines extended far inland, and shallow seas created habitats where mangrove-like forests and rich swamps developed. These swamps in time would produce the coal deposits that we mine today. Insects, always quick to adapt, diversified right alongside the plants. Beetles, butterflies and ants became more varied and numerous, forming the buzzing background of Paleocene forests. Some of the insects you would recognise instantly if you could step into that world, while others would look strange, their lineages long gone by now. Together, they played the same role they do today, pollinating flowers, decomposing plant material, and forming a base for food chains that fed reptiles, birds and mammals. The oceans of the Paleocene were as dynamic as the land. The great marine reptiles that had dominated during the age of dinosaurs were gone, leaving the seas open for new rulers. Sharks continued to thrive, and bony fish diversified. But perhaps the most remarkable story in the oceans was the slow beginning of the whale lineage. Early ancestors of whales still had legs and could walk on land, but they were beginning to spend more and more time in the water. Over millions of years, they would adapt fully to life at sea, eventually becoming the enormous cetaceans we know today. Birds, too, seized their opportunity. Having descended from small feathered dinosaurs, they spread into every corner of the world during the Paleocene. Some evolved into giant, flightless forms, towering over mammals and acting as top predators. In South America, which remained isolated as its own continent, enormous flightless birds with massive beaks became apex hunters, a role they held for millions of years. Smaller birds, meanwhile, filled niches as seed-eaters, insectivores, and fishers, just as they do today. If you could stand on a Paleocene hillside and look across the landscape, you would notice how different the animals looked compared to modern ones. There would be no horses, no cats, no elephants, no bears. Instead, the mammals would seem vaguely familiar but somehow off, as if drawn from memory by someone who had only heard descriptions. A hoofed animal might look like a pig but with strange teeth. A predator might look like a dog but with a head shaped differently. Birds might resemble giant cranes or ostriches but with a more menacing edge. The plants would be lush and tropical, stretching into regions that today are frozen or dry. It's easy to think of the Paleocene as simply the recovery period after the extinction, but it was more than that. It was a time when ecosystems were being reinvented. Without dinosaurs towering over everything, mammals and birds had room to try new strategies. Some succeeded brilliantly, establishing lineages that still exist. Others were experiments that flourished for a while and then disappeared. The tapestry of life was being rewoven, and it looked strikingly different from what had come before. The climate played a crucial role in shaping this age. The Paleocene was warm overall, but there were variations, periods of cooling and warming that pushed ecosystems to adjust. Toward the end of the Paleocene, global temperatures began to rise sharply, leading into the event known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. This brief but intense warming reshaped the world dramatically. and we'll move into that in time, but even before it hit, the stage was already set for major change. The continents during the Paleocene were not in the positions we know them today. North America and Europe were closer together, with land connections that allowed animals to move between them. India was drifting toward Asia, a collision that would eventually give rise to the Himalayas. South America remained isolated, evolving its unique fauna. Australia was beginning to pull away from Antarctica, a separation that would later open ocean currents and alter global climate. The geography of the world was shifting, and with it came new habitats and challenges for life. Think for a moment about what it must have been like for the first large mammals to wander across this landscape. For tens of millions of years, their ancestors had stayed small, overshadowed by massive dinosaurs. Now, with those giants gone, they had space to grow, to try new diets, new body plans, new behaviours. A pantodont chewing leaves in a warm forest might not have realised it, but it was part of a revolution, one that would eventually lead to elephants, rhinos and bison. A small primate climbing through branches might not have known it, but it was laying the groundwork for an entirely new kind of intelligence. This was the dawn after darkness, the first breath of the Cenozoic after catastrophe. It was a time of experimentation, recovery and new beginnings. The earth was warm, lush and strange, filled with animals that would look oddly unfamiliar to us today, but that carried the seeds of the future. As the Paleocene rolled on and gave way to the Eocene, the planet would grow even warmer, the forests would spread even farther, and life would take bold new steps. But here, in the early Cenozoic, the world was still finding its balance, still discovering what life could be without the dinosaurs in charge. The earlier stretch of the Cenozoic carried with it the strange hush that follows disaster, a planet adjusting to loss and beginning to rebuild. Out of that rebuilding came one of the most significant shifts in Earth's history, the slow but steady rise of mammals into the spotlight. For so long they had been small, inconspicuous, living in the long shadow of dinosaurs. They darted at night, crept in burrows, and clung to survival with little chance of claiming dominance. But when the asteroid cleared the skies and emptied the land of its great reptiles, those overlooked creatures stepped into a world suddenly wide open. What unfolded next was the birth of the age of mammals. To understand why this shift was so profound, you have to imagine the contrast. Before the extinction, ecosystems were arranged around massive herbivorous dinosaurs eating entire forests worth of vegetation, and even larger predators hunting them. Mammals in that world were background players, rarely exceeding the size of a raccoon, most closer to a mouse. They had adapted to be survivors in the margins, sharp teeth to gnaw insects, strong senses to avoid being stepped on or eaten, quick reproduction to offset constant danger. They were clever in their own way, but never expansive. The stage was full, and they had no room to expand. After the extinction, the stage was empty in a way it had not been for over 100 million years. The big reptiles were gone, the skies had cleared, and the earth had warmth and food to spare. For mammals, this was the opportunity of a geological lifetime. In the Paleocene, and especially the Eocene that followed, they began to radiate into forms that seemed almost experimental, as if evolution had opened its workshop and started trying every possible design. Some mammals grew larger quickly, filling niches left vacant by dinosaurs. Pantodonts lumbered through forests like early prototypes of rhinos or hippos, heavy-bodied, slow but persistent. Other groups branched into smaller herbivores, gnawing on leaves and seeds, sprouting new kinds of teeth suited to chewing different plants. What is striking is how fast these changes happened on the geological timescale. Within a few million years of the extinction, ecosystems already looked different, mammal-heavy rather than reptile-heavy, with birds soaring overhead as the most visible reminders of the dinosaur age. Predators evolved too. Creodonts became the leading carnivores, a lineage now entirely extinct but once fearsome. They had powerful jaws and teeth designed for slicing flesh, hunting the early herbivores of the Cenozoic. Their dominance lasted for tens of millions of years before true carnivores, the ancestors of cats and dogs, eventually overtook them. For that stretch of time, though, creodonts were the apex hunters, shaping how other mammals evolved to escape, defend, or outsmart them. It wasn't just on land that mammals expanded. In the water, an entirely new chapter began. The ancestors of whales were land-dwelling animals, small hoofed creatures related to deer and hippos. During the early Cenozoic, some of them began spending more time in rivers and coastal shallows hunting fish. Slowly, over millions of years, their bodies changed. Their legs shortened, their tails grew stronger, their nostrils shifted upward, their hearing adapted to water. By the Eocene, they had become fully aquatic, the earliest whales, still bearing tiny hind legs but already sleek and powerful swimmers. From that point forward, the oceans would never be without mammalian giants. Bats also appeared early in this age, taking to the skies in a way no mammal had done before. Their wings were stretched hands, delicate and light, and they developed echolocation to hunt insects at night. With birds filling the daytime skies, bats claimed the night air, and they have held it ever since. That combination of whales in the oceans and bats in the skies shows how flexible mammals were in exploring every available space. Where reptiles had once ruled land, sea, and air, now mammals began to claim each domain. Another important group, the primates, emerged in these early epochs. At first, they were tiny, tree-dwelling creatures with grasping hands and feet, good balance, and forward-facing eyes. They weren't yet monkeys or apes, but they carried the foundation for both. Living in dense forests, they hunted insects, ate fruit, and moved through the canopy with agility. Over time, their brains began to grow slightly larger relative to body size, their social structures more complex. It was a small step in the Paleocene and Eocene, but in hindsight it was one of the most important. That lineage would eventually produce us, but for tens of millions of years primates were just another group of small mammals, among many, not yet special, simply surviving and adjusting as the forest shifted around them. The forests themselves shaped much of this story. In the early Cenozoic, Earth was warmer than it is now, and forests spread far beyond their current ranges. Lush vegetation stretched toward the poles, tropical and subtropical trees flourished in areas now cold and barren. That greenery provided food and shelter for mammals to expand. Many early mammals were arboreal or semi-arboreal, living in the trees or at least depending on them for food. As climates shifted later, grasslands would open, and new kinds of mammals would evolve to run across them, but at first it was the forest that cradled mammalian diversity. One of the most striking moments came about 55 million years ago, during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Temperatures spiked, possibly triggered by enormous releases of carbon dioxide and methane. In this hothouse world, tropical conditions extended nearly to the poles. Crocodiles swam in the Arctic. Palms and rainforests grew in places that now see snow. For mammals, the warmth meant rapid evolution. Many groups spread into new regions, their fossils suddenly appearing far outside the ranges they had occupied before. Small primates, early horses no bigger than a fox, and rodent-like mammals spread widely during this warm period. It was an evolutionary burst, a chance for mammals to diversify on a global scale. That diversification was not just about size or shape, but also behaviour. Mammals began to specialise in diets in ways that had not been possible before. Some evolved grinding molars suited for tough leaves, others sharpened their teeth for cutting meat. Some became omnivores, flexible and adaptable. The variety of feeding strategies mirrored the variety of plants and prey that the warming climate supported. Insects were abundant, seeds plentiful, and fruits widespread, giving small mammals especially an abundance of food to exploit. This age also marked the beginning of social complexity in some mammals. Herding behaviour emerged in certain herbivores, group hunting appeared in some predators, and parental care became increasingly elaborate. While reptiles often laid eggs and moved on, many mammals invested heavily in their young, nursing them, protecting them, and teaching them. That investment meant fewer offspring at a time, but higher chances of survival. It's part of what made mammals resilient, able to weather environmental changes that might have been more devastating for creatures that relied only on sheer numbers. The landscapes of the Cenozoic kept reshaping themselves, and mammals adapted in response. As continents drifted, mountains rose and oceans shifted, new climates and habitats appeared. India continued its collision with Asia, raising the Himalayas, a process that changed global weather patterns. South America remained isolated for tens of millions of years, its mammals evolving along unique paths, producing enormous sloths, armadillo-like giants, and fierce predatory birds. Australia too followed its own course, dominated by marsupials instead of placental mammals, giving rise to kangaroo ancestors, wombats, and marsupial predators that had no equivalents elsewhere. Each continent became its own experiment in what mammals could become. The age of mammals wasn't a single event, but a rolling process, a long chain of opportunities and adaptations. For tens of millions of years after the extinction, mammals expanded in number, in size, in form, and in intelligence. They filled the ecological canvas that had been wiped blank and painted it with endless variation. Some of those early experiments vanished, leaving no descendants. Others thrived and became the ancestors of familiar animals we know today. Horses, elephants, whales, primates, rodents, carnivores, all of them trace their story back to this burst of creativity in the Cenozoic. It's tempting to picture this as inevitable, as though mammals were always destined to inherit the Earth once the dinosaurs were gone. But it wasn't inevitable at all. It was a product of chance and resilience. The asteroid could have struck in a way that left dinosaurs in control, or mammals could have perished along with them, but they survived, and in surviving they found themselves holding the keys to a world ready to be rebuilt. The age of mammals was born not because mammals were waiting for their turn, but because survival and opportunity happened to line up. As the Eocene moved forward, mammals continued their expansion, shaping ecosystems that looked more and more like modern ones. By then, some predators resembled early cats, some herbivores resembled tapirs or deer, some primates began to resemble monkeys. The world was still strange by modern standards, but it was recognizable in ways the Mesozoic had not been. The age of mammals had truly taken hold, and life on Earth was forever changed. As mammals were beginning to find their stride in this new age, the world around them was wrapped in green. The Cenozoic, especially in its earlier chapters, was not just the story of animals rising, but of forests stretching across nearly every corner of the planet. If you picture Earth during the Paleocene and Eocene, what you should imagine first is trees. Endless expanses of broad leaves and tangled branches, canopies that shut out much of the sky, swamps thick with vegetation, vines crawling across every surface, and forests that reached far beyond where they do today. These were not pockets of greenery, but sprawling ecosystems that defined the land, shaping the lives of every creature that lived within them. The warmth of the planet played a huge role. With no polar ice caps and carbon dioxide levels higher than today, the greenhouse climate kept even the far north and south hospitable for dense plant life. Fossil evidence from places like Greenland and Alaska tells us that forests flourished there, full of species that we now associate with tropical or subtropical regions. Crocodiles and turtles lived in those high latitudes, thriving in conditions that seem unimaginable if you stand there now under snow and ice. That warmth created a planet where forests could reach across nearly all latitudes, wrapping Earth in a green cloak. Imagine walking through such a forest. The air would be heavy with humidity, the ground soft with layers of fallen leaves, fungi and moss. towering trees would block most of the sunlight, creating a world of shade and shadow. Insects buzzed constantly, their populations booming with the abundance of food. Birds flitted through the canopy, some small and song-filled, others large and flightless, stalking prey along the forest floor. Mammals moved in the underbrush, some small and rodent-like, others heavier, browsing leaves or fruit. Primates, still in their early stages, leapt from branch to branch, their grasping hands and feet perfectly suited for this world of wood and vine. Forests during the early Cenozoic were dominated by angiosperms, flowering plants that had already risen in the Cretaceous, but now spread more widely. Magnolias, palms, sycamores, and countless others thrived. Ferns and conifers remained part of the landscape too, especially in cooler or wetter pockets, but it was the flowering plants that defined the age. Their flowers drew insects, their fruits fed mammals and birds, and their roots helped stabilize soils in ways that shaped rivers and wetlands. The partnership between flowering plants and pollinating insects deepened, a relationship that still structures much of life on Earth today. One of the most remarkable aspects of these forests was their reach. Fossils show us that palms grew in Wyoming, crocodiles swam in Arctic rivers, and dawn redwoods stood tall in what are now polar regions. The forests blurred the distinction between tropical and temperate, creating ecosystems that were both familiar and strange. For mammals evolving within them, the forest provided food, shelter, and endless niches to exploit. Those early primates, for example, would never have thrived in a barren grassland. Their survival depended on trees, and the trees were everywhere. These forests also tell us something about how Earth's climate system can operate. When carbon dioxide levels rise, warmth spreads, and forests can follow. The Cenozoic shows that our planet is capable of hosting a nearly ice-free world dominated by green. But those same conditions come with consequences. With so much vegetation, decomposition was rapid, producing layers of rich soil in some places and coal beds in others. Swamps trapped organic matter that would, over millions of years, become fossil fuels. Rivers wound through dense forests, carrying sediments that layered into rocks we now study. Every tree that grew, every leaf that fell, became part of Earth's geological record. Animals adapted to this forested planet in fascinating ways. Many early mammals developed traits that worked well in dense vegetation: flexible ankles for climbing, sharp eyes for spotting movement in low light, and diets that included fruit, leaves, and insects. Some grew larger and specialized, while others stayed small and nimble. For herbivores, the abundance of soft vegetation made browsing easy. For predators, dense cover meant ambush hunting rather than long chases. Birds, too, evolved in step with the forests. Some spread into niches as fruit eaters, others as insect hunters, still others as ground-dwelling giants in areas where the canopy gave way to more open patches. The sheer productivity of these forests made them engines of evolution. Insects diversified alongside flowering plants, creating complex webs of pollination and predation. Mammals took advantage of the fruits and seeds, spreading them far and wide. Predators learned to adapt to prey that could climb, fly, or hide among thick undergrowth. And when climates shifted, those forests pulled back or surged forward, carrying species with them and reshaping the map of biodiversity. Toward the end of the Paleocene and into the Eocene, the world entered one of its warmest stretches in all of Earth's history. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum pushed global temperatures even higher, flooding the planet with tropical conditions. Forests spread almost to the poles. Imagine standing in what is now northern Canada and seeing a landscape not of spruce and pine, but of broad-leaved trees and crocodiles in the rivers. That warmth triggered migrations of mammals across continents, as animals adapted to one region suddenly found suitable conditions in another. Fossils show sudden appearances of species far outside their previous ranges, evidence of a planet in flux, its forests pulling life along like green highways. But forests are never static. As the Eocene gave way to later epochs, climates began to cool and forests retreated. Grasslands slowly expanded in some regions, setting the stage for a very different kind of world. Yet during the height of the Cenozoic forests, for millions upon millions of years, they were the dominant backdrop. They were the great stage on which mammals found their first major opportunities, where primates began their long climb toward complexity, where early horses browsed leaves in shaded clearings, and where bats filled the night air with their calls. To appreciate just how sweeping these forests were, think about the distribution of life today. Tropical forests like the Amazon, the Congo, or Southeast Asia are rich but limited in their reach. In the early Cenozoic, that kind of richness stretched across continents, touching places we now think of as too cold or too dry. The planet was, in many ways, a greenhouse garden, overflowing with green. That abundance was both a gift and a challenge. It meant food and shelter, but it also meant competition, predators lurking behind every tree, parasites thriving in humid air, and constant adaptation to dense and changing environments. Fossils of plants from this time give us an extraordinary window into these ecosystems. Leaf impressions, fossilized pollen, and petrified wood all tell the story of forests that look familiar yet slightly off. A magnolia leaf from Wyoming, a palm trunk from Alaska, a pollen grain from what is now Europe. Each piece is a reminder that the world once looked very different. And when paired with the fossils of animals found nearby, they sketch a picture of entire ecosystems that stretched beyond anything we know now. The dominance of forests also shaped the chemistry of the atmosphere. Plants pulled in carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen, helping to regulate the balance of gases in the air. The interplay between forests and climate was constant. When forests expanded, they drew down carbon, cooling the planet slightly. When climates warmed and forests spread even more, they locked carbon into soils and swamps. That feedback loop created both stability and bursts of change, contributing to the swings of temperature and environment that define the Cenozoic. What stands out in this age of forest is how interconnected everything was. The plants shaped the animals shaped the plants, and the climate steered them both. A small mammal gnawing on fruit wasn't just feeding itself, it was carrying seeds that would sprout into new trees miles away. A bird pecking at insects was not just surviving, it was keeping those insects in check so that the leaves of the forest could continue to grow. A primate leaping through branches was not just navigating its world, it was practicing the skills that would one day lead to complex societies and intelligence. The forests of the early Cenozoic were not merely scenery, they were the very framework of life. They cradled the rise of mammals, gave shape to ecosystems, and set the stage for the next transformations to come. As climates cooled and grasslands spread, as mountains rose and oceans shifted, the forests would recede from their global dominance. But for millions of years they held sway, covering the world in green, humming with insects, echoing with bird calls, and rustling with the movement of mammals just beginning to discover what they could become. When the asteroid struck and the dust began to settle, the survivors on land didn't look like future rulers of the planet. They were small, many no bigger than rats or rabbits, darting through the undergrowth, hiding from predators, and feeding on insects, seeds, and whatever scraps of vegetation remained. These creatures didn't seem destined for greatness, yet from their fragile lineages would eventually come elephants, horses, whales, apes, and countless other giants. The Cenozoic, more than anything else, is a story of strange survivors who grew, changed, and sometimes reached extraordinary sizes. From tiny burrowers to massive beasts that would make you stop in your tracks if you saw them today, this age was full of surprises. At first, size was still modest. In the Paleocene, the mammals that rose up in the wake of the dinosaurs tended to stay small to medium, rarely exceeding the size of a modern dog. But even in that early stage, some were beginning to push the limits. Pantodonts, for example, were among the first to grow truly large. Clumsy-looking with heavy bodies and blunt teeth, they browsed on soft vegetation and may have reached weights comparable to small rhinos. For an animal that had only recently emerged from a world dominated by mouse-sized mammals, that was a dramatic leap. Pantodonts looked awkward, perhaps even ungainly, but they represented an early experiment in being big. There were others too that began to carve out unusual forms. Multituberculates, one of the most successful mammal groups of the time, developed gnawing teeth that allowed them to eat a wide variety of foods. They weren't giants, but their adaptability let them spread everywhere. They were the rodents before rodents, small but resilient, and their success lasted for tens of millions of years before true rodents eventually replaced them. It's easy to forget creatures like these because they didn't leave descendants, but in their time they were some of the most abundant mammals on Earth. Predators in the early Cenozoic weren't cats or dogs, but creodonts. These carnivorous mammals, now entirely extinct, looked vaguely like wolves or hyenas, but belonged to their own lineage. Some were small, scurrying hunters of insects and small prey, while others grew larger, stalking herbivores through dense forests. They held the role of topland predators for much of the Paleocene and Eocene. Though their time eventually ended, replaced by the ancestors of today's carnivores, they show how flexible mammalian evolution was in exploring new ecological spaces. One of the most fascinating groups of survivors were the primates. In the Paleocene and early Eocene, they were tiny tree-dwelling creatures no larger than squirrels. They had grasping hands and feet, sharp vision, and a lifestyle suited to forest canopies. From those small beginnings came monkeys, apes, and eventually humans, but for tens of millions of years they were simply one of many small mammal groups scrambling through the branches. If you saw them then, you wouldn't have recognized their connection to us. They were just another group of survivors, holding on and adapting to a forested world. The oceans had their own stories of survival and transformation. The extinction had wiped out marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, but mammals began to fill the gap. Early whale ancestors, called archaeocetes, started as four-legged land-dwelling creatures that ventured into rivers and shallow seas. Over time, they became more aquatic, their bodies elongating, their limbs shrinking, their nostrils sliding upward toward the top of the head. Within the Eocene, whales had become fully marine, powerful swimmers that hunted fish and squid. Some grew enormous, and for the first time in Earth's history, the oceans had mammalian giants. Meanwhile, bats were testing the skies. They appear in the fossil record in the early Eocene, already capable of flight and echolocation. Their wings, stretched across elongated fingers, gave them access to a nighttime world rich with insects. In a planet dominated by forests, the ability to fly at night and hunt in the dark was a brilliant strategy. They remain one of the most successful groups of mammals today, but their roots trace back to that same wave of survivors exploring every niche they could. The march from small to giant didn't happen evenly. For some lineages, size was the key to success. Larger herbivores could reach higher leaves, deter smaller predators, and travel longer distances. Larger predators could bring down bigger prey. But being big came with costs too. It meant needing more food, producing fewer offspring, and being more vulnerable to sudden climate shifts. Some giants flourished for millions of years before vanishing. Others shrank again, adapting to changing conditions. One particularly odd group, the Euanthatheras, lived during the Eocene. They were massive herbivores, with bulky bodies and strange skulls covered in bony knobs and protrusions. Some had saber-like canine teeth, unusual for plant eaters. They looked like something dreamed up from scraps of other animals, a mixture of rhinoceros, elephant and hippo, but belonging to none of those groups. For a few million years they were among the largest mammals alive, before disappearing entirely, leaving behind no descendants. They were evolutionary experiments, successful for a while but ultimately temporary. South America, isolated during much of the Cenozoic, became a land of strange survivors all its own. Without competition from northern predators, Enormous flightless birds known as Forus racids, or terror birds, became top hunters. Some grew taller than humans, with sharp beaks powerful enough to crush bone. Alongside them lived sloths that eventually grew to the size of elephants, armadillo-like glyptodonts with shells as big as cars, and giant rodent relatives heavier than a person. Isolation turned South America into an evolutionary laboratory, producing giants that would have seemed bizarre anywhere else. Australia followed a different path. Cut off from the other continents, it became dominated by marsupials. Some grew into massive kangaroo ancestors, others into carnivorous predators like Thylacoleo, a marsupial lion with slicing teeth and strong forelimbs. For tens of millions of years, Australia's mammals developed almost entirely apart from placental mammals, giving the continent its uniquely strange wildlife. The survivors there show how much geography mattered in shaping what became giants and what remained small. As the Cenozoic rolled forward, size extremes became more common. Horses, which started out in the Eocene no bigger than foxes, eventually grew into the powerful grazers we know today. Elephants began with small pig-like ancestors before evolving into towering tusked giants. Rhinos too grew from modest beginnings into some of the largest land mammals ever, with some species in the Miocene and Oligocene standing taller than modern giraffes. The record holder for size among land mammals, Parasauritherium, lived during the Oligocene and could reach nearly 20 feet at the shoulder, weighing more than 20 tons. From tiny beginnings, the age had produced true behemoths. But size was not always the measure of survival. Many of the most successful mammal groups remained small. Rodents, for example, spread across the world, their ever-growing teeth allowing them to exploit countless food sources. Insects provided a reliable diet for bats and small primates. Shrews and moles flourished in underground burrows. These animals thrived not by becoming massive, but by reproducing quickly, adapting easily, and exploiting the details of ecosystems too small for giants to notice. In the balance of survival, both tiny and titanic forms had their place. The diversity of sizes also reflected the shifting environments of the Cenozoic. In the lush greenhouse forests of the early age, small mammals found plenty of cover and food. As climates cooled and grasslands expanded, larger grazers evolved to roam the open plains, and predators grew larger to chase them. The constant push and pull of climate and vegetation shaped who grew, who shrank, and who disappeared. When we look back on these survivors, it's tempting to focus only on the giants because they're so dramatic. A sloth, the size of an elephant, a bird taller than a person, a rhino that could tower over a bus. These images are striking. But the true story of survival includes the small creatures as well, the ones that stayed hidden, reproduced quickly, and slipped through the cracks of extinction after extinction. Without them, there would be no forests buzzing with life, no predators to shape ecosystems, no lineage that would eventually become us. From the beginning of the Cenozoic to now, mammals have stretched themselves into every possible size, from bats that weigh less than a coin to whales that outweigh any dinosaur. That spectrum is the mark of a group that not only survived but thrived, using every trick evolution could offer. The giants may catch our imagination, but the tiniest survivors are just as important. Together, they made the Cenozoic a time when life reinvented itself in forms that were both strange and familiar, fragile and mighty, tiny and titanic. The oceans of the Cenozoic were as full of transformation as the land. When the asteroid struck at the end of the Cretaceous, the seas lost their great reptilian rulers. Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and many other marine reptiles disappeared almost overnight. The extinction also wiped out countless species of ammonites, marine invertebrates that had filled the oceans for hundreds of millions of years. It might have seemed at first like the oceans were emptier, quieter, a world in retreat. But just as on land, the survivors wasted no time in reshaping the stage. And what rose from the aftermath was a new cast of characters, including one of the most remarkable stories in the history of life. the transformation of land mammals into whales. The early Cenozoic seas were dominated by fish and sharks, which quickly recovered and diversified after the extinction. Sharks had already survived several mass extinctions, and their resilience once again proved unmatched. With less competition from large marine reptiles, they spread into new niches. Fossil records show that many modern shark groups trace their origins back to the Paleocene and Eocene. Rays and skates also flourished, filling the shallow seas with their graceful gliding forms. Bony fish diversified further, becoming the backbone of marine ecosystems. But the story that truly stands out begins not in the ocean itself, but on land. Around 50 million years ago, a group of small hoofed mammals living near rivers and coastlines began to spend more time in the water. These creatures, related to early even-toed ungulates, resembled small deer or pig-like animals. One of the earliest known is Pachycetus, an animal with 4 sturdy legs, a long snout, and teeth suited for eating fish. It could walk on land perfectly well, but evidence from its ear bones shows that it was already developing adaptations for hearing underwater. Pachycetus marks the first step on the long road to whales. From there, the transformation continued. Ambulocetus, sometimes called the walking whale, appeared a little later. It had short legs with webbed feet, a long body, and a powerful tail. It likely swam much like an otter or crocodile, paddling with its limbs and undulating its body. Ambulocetus could still come onto land, though it may have been clumsy there, but in the water it was agile and dangerous. Its jaws and teeth suggest it hunted fish, and perhaps even ambushed animals at the water's edge, much like a crocodile. With Ambulocetus, the whale lineage had clearly committed to an aquatic lifestyle, though it had not yet abandoned the land entirely. Over millions of years, these early whales became more aquatic. Rhodhocetus, for instance, had shorter limbs and more streamlined bodies than its predecessors. Its pelvis was reduced, making it less capable of supporting itself on land. It swam with powerful strokes of its tail and could dive more effectively. Basilosaurus, a later form, was a true marine giant. Stretching up to 60 feet long, it looked more like a sea serpent than a modern whale, with an elongated body and small hind limbs reduced almost to vestiges. Basilosaurus could not walk on land at all, but it still carried tiny back legs, evolutionary echoes of its terrestrial past. This journey from land dweller to ocean giant is one of the clearest examples of macroevolution we have, a direct record of how natural selection reshaped an entire lineage. Each step left fossils that show transitional features, limbs becoming flippers, nostrils sliding up the skull to form blowholes, ear bones adapting for underwater sound, bodies elongating for efficient swimming. By the late Eocene, whales had fully conquered the oceans. Some evolved into filter-feeding baleen whales, while others became the toothed whales, ancestors of dolphins and orcas. From small hoofed mammals came creatures larger than any dinosaur had ever been, the true giants of the sea. Alongside whales, other marine mammals also appeared during the Cenozoic. Seals, sea lions, and walruses evolved from carnivorous land mammals that returned to the sea in a different way. Unlike whales, they retained the ability to come ashore and still do today. Manatees and dugongs, the sirenians, also evolved in the Eocene related to elephants rather than whales. These slow-moving herbivores grazed on seagrass in shallow waters, shaping coastal ecosystems much as they still do. The oceans of the Cenozoic weren't just fish and invertebrates anymore, they were increasingly mammalian. The coral reefs of the Cenozoic also tell part of this story. After the extinction, reefs collapsed in many places, but they rebuilt themselves in the New Age. Corals flourished again, creating vast reef systems that became hubs of biodiversity. These reefs supported fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and the first appearances of many modern reef dwellers. They also provided safe havens for juvenile animals, places where life could shelter and grow before venturing into open waters. The reef ecosystems we see today have their roots in this recovery and expansion during the Cenozoic. The oceans themselves were not static. Currents shifted as continents moved. When South America remained connected to Antarctica, warm currents circled freely, keeping the poles mild. But as South America drifted northward and separated from Antarctica, a circumpolar current developed around the southern continent. That isolation allowed Antarctica to freeze, beginning the long march toward ice ages. Ocean circulation patterns changed with it, redistributing heat around the globe and altering marine ecosystems. The opening and closing of seaways, such as the connection between North and South America or between Africa and Eurasia, repeatedly reshaped ocean life. The rise of plankton also played a crucial role. Tiny as they are, plankton form the base of marine food chains. During the Cenozoic, diatoms and other plankton groups expanded dramatically. Their silica shells contributed to thick deposits on the ocean floor, building the white cliffs and silty sediments we see today. More importantly, they supported the growth of larger marine animals. The evolution of baleen whales, for example, was tied to the abundance of plankton and krill, which allowed giants to filter vast quantities of food from the water. Without plankton blooms, the modern giants of the sea would not exist. The Cenozoic seas were not just rich in mammals, but also in oddities. Giant penguins lived during the Paleocene and Eocene, some standing taller than a person. They waddled on land but swam powerfully underwater, hunting fish in warm southern seas. Sharks reached enormous sizes too, most famously with Megalodon in the Miocene, a predator that could grow over 50 feet long and prey on whales. Though Megalodon eventually went extinct, it remains one of the most iconic marine giants of the age. All of these changes show how dynamic the oceans were during the Cenozoic. They began the era as worlds emptied of reptiles and ammonites, and they filled again with mammals, fish, birds and invertebrates. The return of giants, this time mammals rather than reptiles, reminds us how quickly life can adapt to opportunities. From Pachycetus on a riverbank to Basilosaurus in the open ocean was only a few million years, a blink in deep time. And from there to the blue whales that glide through the oceans today was just another step. If you imagine standing on the shore during the early Eocene, you might see an animal like Ambulocetus lumbering out of the water, jaws dripping, eyes scanning for prey. A few million years later, in the same spot, you might watch Basilosaurus slicing through waves, too long and serpentine to look anything like modern whales, but already a master of the seas. And today, in those waters, you might see a humpback leap, a dolphin pod break the surface, or a manatee graze on seagrass. The continuity is unbroken, the story written in bodies that still carry echoes of walking ancestors. The oceans of the Cenozoic were never just background. They were active players in Earth's history, shaping climate, supporting life, and hosting some of the most extraordinary transformations evolution has ever produced. They remind us that survival doesn't always mean staying the same. Sometimes it means changing completely, leaving behind legs for flippers, air for water, and land for the endless blue of the sea. When you think of Earth today, you picture a planet of contrasts. Ice at the poles, deserts near the tropics, temperate forests, grasslands, mountains capped in snow. But in the early Cenozoic, especially during one extraordinary stretch, the world was far more uniform. Instead of the sharp boundaries we know, there was green stretching almost everywhere. Forests crept nearly to the poles, crocodiles and turtles lived in the high latitudes, and the world felt more like one vast tropical garden than a patchwork of climates. This was the time when Earth turned tropical everywhere. The conditions that made it possible started with the aftermath of the asteroid impact. Greenhouse gases lingered in the atmosphere, and volcanism continued to release carbon dioxide. Without ice at the poles, the oceans absorbed and redistributed heat more evenly across the globe. Sea levels were higher, flooding continental interiors and creating shallow seas that warmed quickly in the sun. The result was a world where warmth reached farther than it does today, and life adapted to thrive in it. By the Eocene, around 56 million years ago, this greenhouse world had reached its peak. Fossils from high-latitude regions tell us that forests of broadleaf trees and palms grew in places like Greenland and Antarctica. Imagine standing in what is now the Arctic Circle and seeing dense forests alive with insects, birds and small mammals. The long dark winters would have been challenging, but the warmth allowed vegetation to flourish. Crocodiles swam in polar rivers, evidence of just how mild the climate was. One of the most dramatic events in this tropical phase was the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. About 55 million years ago, global temperatures rose sharply in a geologic instant, likely caused by the release of massive amounts of carbon dioxide and methane. It may have come from volcanic activity, methane hydrates melting from the seafloor or other sources, but the effect was profound. The planet warmed by several degrees in just a few thousand years, a blink in geological time. With that warming, tropical and subtropical climates pushed farther than ever before. This sudden heat reshaped ecosystems. Mammals responded by spreading across continents. Fossil evidence shows primates, early horses, and other groups appearing suddenly in places they hadn't been before, their ranges expanding with the warmth. For some, this was a golden age of dispersal, a chance to move freely across forests that stretched for thousands of miles. For others, it was a challenge, as rising temperatures altered vegetation and water availability. Still, the net effect was a planet buzzing with life, much of it in forms adapted for warm, humid conditions. Forests dominated these landscapes. Thick, tropical vegetation created canopies that shaded the ground and offered food for browsers and climbers. Insects flourished, pollinating flowers and recycling organic matter. Birds diversified into countless forms, some filling the role of fruit eaters, others of predators, still others of insect specialists. Mammals clambered through the branches, some no larger than squirrels, others as heavy as tapirs. It was a world of abundance, though not without its dangers, as predators lurked among the trees and diseases thrived in the humid air. One of the striking features of this tropical world is how it blurred the distinction between regions. Today, latitude determines so much of what grows and lives in a place. But during the height of the Eocene, those distinctions faded. A forest in Wyoming might have had palms, magnolias and crocodiles, a mix we associate now with equatorial zones. High-latitude regions, while darker in winter, were warm enough to support plants and animals that today would be impossible so far north or south. The tropics, instead of being confined to a belt around the equator, had spilled across much of the planet. Marine life reflected these changes too. Warmer oceans altered currents, spreading tropical conditions into higher latitudes. Coral reefs flourished, extending farther than they do today. Warm water fish lived in places we now think of as temperate or cold seas. Whales, still early in their evolution, swam through balmy waters far outside the equatorial zones. Even plankton, microscopic though they are, responded to the warmth, their populations shifting and leaving chemical signatures in sediments that scientists can still measure today. This tropical planet was not without challenges. Warmer climates meant more intense rainfall in some areas, leading to widespread wetlands and swamps. In other places, droughts could strike, stressing plants and animals that relied on steady water. The warmth also limited the development of grasslands, keeping much of the land covered in forests. While this worked well for tree dwellers and browsers, it delayed the rise of grazing mammals that would later dominate open plains. The world was full, lush and green, but also precarious, its balance tied closely to greenhouse conditions that could shift abruptly. Over time, those shifts did come. After the thermal maximum, global temperatures began a slow decline, interrupted by smaller warming events but trending downward. As climates cooled, forests began to retreat from the poles, giving way to more seasonal ecosystems. Grasslands started to appear, though at first only in limited areas. The tropical everywhere phase faded, replaced by a world with sharper contrasts. Still, for millions of years, Earth had been a planet of near-universal green, and the legacy of that period remained in the lineages of animals and plants that had adapted to it. For mammals, the tropical world was a springboard. Early primates thrived in the dense forest, spreading widely and diversifying into new forms. Hoofed mammals browsed on leaves and fruits, some growing larger, others staying small and nimble. Predators evolved sharper senses and stealthier tactics to hunt in dense vegetation. Even the ancestors of whales likely benefited, as warm coastal waters provided rich feeding grounds for creatures transitioning from land to sea. The abundance of food and shelter allowed many lineages to take risks, try new strategies, and flourish in ways that would echo throughout the rest of the Cenozoic. Plants, too, took advantage of the warmth. Flowering plants spread into nearly every corner of the globe, creating partnerships with insects and birds that remain fundamental today. Pollen records show vast ranges for species that are now confined to small tropical regions. Forests became engines of productivity, pulling carbon from the atmosphere and locking it into soils and sediments. The carbon cycle of the planet was deeply tied to these forests, and when climates cooled later, their retreat would alter that balance significantly. For us, looking back, this world is almost alien. It's hard to picture crocodiles swimming in Arctic rivers, or palms growing in Alaska, or rainforests covering what are now deserts and prairies. Yet the evidence is clear in fossils, sediments, and chemical traces. The tropical everywhere planet was real, and it shaped the course of life in profound ways. It shows us that Earth's climate can be radically different, that what seems normal now is just one version among many. The lesson of this time is that life is deeply adaptable, but it is also deeply dependent on climate. When the world warmed, forests spread and animals followed. When the world cooled, forests retreated and new ecosystems emerged. The tropical planet was not permanent, but it left behind a record of resilience and transformation. It gave mammals the opportunity to rise, it gave primates the chance to flourish, and it set the stage for the grasslands and ice ages that would come later. For millions of years, Earth wore a green cloak that stretched from pole to pole, a vision of abundance unlike anything we know today. It was the time when the tropics were not confined, when warmth ruled, when forests reigned everywhere. And though that age is gone, the echoes remain in the fossils of crocodiles found far north, in the pollen grains of palms buried deep in sediments, and in the living descendants of mammals that once scurried through those endless canopies. The warmth of the early Cenozoic was already remarkable, but there was one moment when that warmth surged beyond even its usual extremes. It was a geologic instant that unsettled ecosystems, reshaped coastlines, and left a mark so distinct in the fossil record and in sediments that scientists can still see it today. This moment is known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, sometimes simply called the Eocene heat wave. It was a planetary fever, and though it lasted only about 200,000 years, it changed the course of life in ways that echoed for millions afterward. To understand what made this event mysterious, you first need to imagine just how sudden it was. In the language of geology, sudden usually means millions of years, but the heatwave began in less than 20,000, possibly less than 10. That's almost instantaneous on the scale of deep time. Within that short window, global temperatures rose by at least 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. The poles, already mild compared to today, became almost subtropical. Tropical zones pushed farther outward, and ecosystems shifted rapidly. For the plants and animals living through it, the world transformed within only a few hundred generations. The trigger remains debated. Some evidence suggests a massive release of carbon dioxide from volcanic activity, especially in regions like what is now Iceland, where huge volcanic outpourings occurred around that time. Other evidence points to methane hydrates, vast amounts of frozen methane trapped in seafloor sediments, suddenly destabilizing and bubbling into the atmosphere. Methane is an even more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and a rapid release could have pushed the climate into overdrive. Whatever the source, the result was clear. The atmosphere loaded with greenhouse gases, and Earth tipped into one of the warmest intervals it has experienced since the extinction of the dinosaurs. The consequences were everywhere. In the oceans, the chemistry shifted as higher carbon dioxide levels made waters more acidic. This stress affected marine life, particularly tiny foraminifera, plankton with calcium carbonate shells that are sensitive to acidity. Fossil records show many lineages went extinct during this period, while others rapidly evolved. In the open sea, surface temperatures rose, currents changed, and ecosystems reorganized. Coral reefs retreated in some areas, while other organisms took their place. The ocean floor itself recorded the event in sediment stained with unusual chemical signatures, clear markers of the heat wave. On land, forests that were already widespread surged even farther. Tropical and subtropical plants grew in regions far from the equator, and animals followed. Fossils show the sudden appearance of mammal groups in new places, evidence that warming opened migration routes and new habitats. Small horses, primates, and artiodactyls expanded into North America and Europe within just a few thousand years, a migration wave made possible by the warmth. The event essentially acted as a launchpad for many mammal lineages that would later dominate the Cenozoic. It's worth imagining what it might have felt like to be an animal in this world. If you were a small primate living in a dense forest, the warmth meant more fruit, more insects, more opportunities to spread into new trees and new territories. If you were a horse ancestor, small and forest-dwelling, the warmth meant ranges extending farther, new landscapes to explore, and less harsh seasonality. If you were an insect, it meant exploding populations in the humid, lush conditions. But not everything thrived. Some species couldn't adapt to the rapid pace of change, and they vanished. Survival in this heat wave depended on flexibility, on the ability to move, adjust, and make use of new opportunities. For scientists, the heat wave is mysterious not only because of its trigger, but also because of its role as a test case. It shows us what happens when carbon floods the atmosphere quickly. The parallels to today's warming are striking, though the sources are different. During the heat wave, Earth's systems responded dramatically. Temperatures spiked, ice vanished, oceans acidified, and ecosystems reorganized. It took more than 100,000 years for the planet to fully recover. That recovery was slow, relying on natural processes like weathering of rocks to draw carbon dioxide back down. The fact that we can still trace the event so clearly in sediments makes it one of the most studied intervals in paleoclimate science. The mammals that lived through it were profoundly shaped by it. The ancestors of primates spread widely, setting the stage for their later diversification. Hoofed mammals radiated into new forms. Rodents expanded. Many of these groups are still with us today, their early expansions tied to this brief but intense warm spike. The heat wave acted like a forced evolutionary experiment, shaking up ecosystems and demanding quick responses. Those that could respond flourished. Those that couldn't disappeared. One of the intriguing patterns is that many mammals became smaller during the heat wave. Fossil evidence suggests dwarfing was common, perhaps because higher temperatures and reduced nutrient availability put pressure on body size. Smaller animals need less food and can reproduce more quickly, advantages in a stressed environment. Horses shrank to sizes smaller than a house cat. Primates remained tiny, and many other groups show similar trends. It was as if the planet favoured the small and nimble during its fever, a striking reversal from the usual story of mammals growing larger in the Cenozoic. The Eocene heatwave didn't just shape life, it also left permanent imprints in the geological record. Cores drilled from ocean sediments show a sharp change in carbon isotope ratios, a chemical fingerprint of massive carbon release. Layers of clay and silt from this time hold clues about altered rainfall patterns, increased weathering of rocks, and the redistribution of sediments by swollen rivers. Even fossil leaves tell the story. Their shapes, sizes, and arrangements shifted in response to the warmth. giving us direct evidence of how plant communities adapted. It's one of the best documented ancient climate events, a snapshot of Earth pushed into a hothouse state. Though the heatwave eventually ended, its legacy lingered. When temperatures began to cool again, ecosystems didn't simply reset. The lineages that had spread during the warmth remained. The evolutionary experiments that had succeeded carried on. Horses grew larger again, primates continued to diversify, and hoofed mammals spread across continents. The recovery was not a return to the old balance, but the establishment of a new one, shaped by the survivors of the fever. For us, the heatwave offers perspective. It shows how quickly Earth can change when greenhouse gases surge. It shows how life adapts, sometimes flourishing, sometimes shrinking, sometimes disappearing altogether. And it shows that recovery is slow, measured not in centuries but in tens of thousands of years. The Eocene heatwave is long gone, but its lessons echo loudly today as we consider the changes we're driving in our own time. If you picture Earth during this heatwave, imagine a planet without polar ice, with crocodiles in the Arctic, with rainforests stretching across continents, and with mammals on the move, spreading into new lands. Imagine oceans warmer and more acidic, with currents disrupted and species shifting their ranges. Imagine small horses darting through dense forests, primates leaping into unfamiliar trees, and whales just beginning their march toward the open sea. It was a world both lush and unstable, a fevered Earth that would eventually cool but never quite forget the experience. The mysterious heat wave of the Eocene was not just a blip in climate history, it was a turning point. It reshaped ecosystems, accelerated evolution, and left marks in stone and fossil that we still read today. It was a reminder that Earth's climate is not fixed, that it can swing rapidly under the right pressures, and that life is both fragile and resilient in the face of such swings. And in the long unfolding story of the Cenozoic, it was one of the defining moments, the fever that reshaped the age of mammals and set the stage for everything that followed. As the Eocene warmth gradually began to ease and the planet edged toward cooler conditions, the dominance of forests that had wrapped the Earth from pole to pole started to shift. For tens of millions of years, trees had defined the landscapes, and mammals had evolved in their shade, climbing, browsing, and hiding under dense canopies. But climates do not hold still, and by the Oligocene and Miocene epochs, Earth was changing in ways that would reshape ecosystems profoundly. Grasslands began to spread, first in small patches and then sweeping expanses, creating open environments that invited a new wave of mammal evolution. It was the rise of the grazers, and with them came a transformation in the very rhythm of the land. Grasses had actually existed for a long time, appearing well before the Cenozoic, but during the age of forest they remained minor players, tucked into clearings or riverbanks. They were hardy, capable of withstanding drought, grazing and fire, but in a world covered mostly in trees they couldn't dominate. That changed as climates cooled and dried. Forests retreated in many regions, especially continental interiors, and open habitats became more common. In those spaces, grasses spread like wildfire, forming the first true grasslands. These new ecosystems were unlike anything Earth had seen before, and animals responded quickly. For herbivores, grasslands posed both challenges and opportunities. Grasses are tough. They contain silica in their tissues, which makes them abrasive to chew. For mammals used to browsing on soft leaves or fruit, eating grass was hard on the teeth. Over time, though, new dental adaptations evolved. Hypsodonty, or high-crowned teeth, appeared in many grazing mammals, allowing them to grind down tough grasses without wearing out their teeth too quickly. Horses are the most famous example, but similar adaptations appeared in other groups too, from antelope ancestors to rhinoceroses. The spread of grasslands and the evolution of these dental traits are so closely linked that paleontologists can track one through the other. The open plains also demanded new body plans and behaviours. In dense forests, Survival often depended on agility, camouflage, or the ability to climb. In open grasslands, speed and endurance became more valuable. Predators could be seen from far away, and the only defense was often to outrun them. Herbivores grew longer legs, more efficient lungs, and body shapes built for running. Horses elongated their limbs and stood on a single toe, the beginnings of the hooves we know today. Antelope ancestors developed slender bills and the capacity for bursts of speed. Even elephants, though massive, adapted to roam widely across open savannas. Predators adapted in step with their prey. Creodonts still roamed in some places, but the rise of modern carnivorans, cats, dogs, hyenas, was already underway. These hunters developed speed, stamina, and cooperative strategies that suited open habitats. Pack hunting emerged as a strategy among dog-like carnivores, allowing them to bring down larger grazers in the open. Cats honed their ambush skills, relying on stealth until the last possible moment, then unleashing bursts of speed. Grasslands weren't just about herbivores spreading. They were arenas of constant chase and pursuit, predator and prey locked in a cycle of adaptation. The rise of grasslands also reshaped entire continents. In North America, herds of horses, camels, and antelope ancestors filled the plains. In Africa, early bovids spread, alongside evolving elephants and giraffes. In Eurasia, vast steppes became home to rhinos, gazelles, and the ancestors of bison. South America, still isolated until later in the Cenozoic, developed its own grazers, including giant relatives of rodents and sloths. Wherever grass spread, grazers followed, and with them came predators, scavengers, and the complex web of life that characterizes open ecosystems. What made grasses so transformative was not just their toughness, but their ability to regrow quickly. Unlike many plants, grasses grow from the base of their leaves rather than the tips. This means that when grazed down by herbivores, they can regrow without being killed. This adaptation allowed them to thrive under heavy grazing pressure. Instead of being wiped out by hungry herds, they flourished because of them. The relationship between grasses and grazers became a feedback loop, each supporting the success of the other. Herds of herbivores kept grasslands open by trampling and eating, while grasses fed those herds and regrew again and again. The soils of grasslands also played a role. With deep root systems, grasses stabilized soils and trapped carbon underground. Over time, this contributed to changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, which in turn influenced climate. The expansion of grasslands wasn't just an ecological event, it was part of the planet's geochemical cycle. It helped drive Earth further into cooler, drier conditions, reinforcing the very environments that grasses preferred. In this way, the plants themselves participated in shaping the climate of the Cenozoic. From a distance, these open plains must have looked dramatically different from the lush forest that had come before. Instead of towering canopies and dim understories, there were rolling waves of grass stretching as far as the eye could see. Herds moved across them in seasonal patterns, following rains and fresh growth. Predators watched from ridges or stalked low through the grasses. Birds filled the skies, some scavenging, others preying on insects stirred up by the grazing herds. Insects themselves flourished in these new habitats, from grasshoppers to beetles to pollinators, creating a hum of activity that defined the grassland soundscape. The rise of grasslands and grazers also influenced the behaviour of mammals in more subtle ways. Herding became more common, a strategy that offered protection in numbers. Migration emerged as herds followed the cycles of rainfall and growth, covering vast distances. Social structures grew more complex in some species, as living in groups required coordination, communication, and sometimes cooperation. Predators, too, responded with new strategies, some forming packs, others specializing in ambush tactics suited to the open terrain. Life on the grasslands demanded constant motion, vigilance, and adaptability. By the Miocene, roughly 20 million years ago, grasslands had become a dominant ecosystem in many parts of the world. It was a golden age for grazers, with enormous herds shaping the land. Horses diversified into multiple forms, some small and forest adapted, others tall and plains running. Antelope and bovid ancestors spread across Africa and Eurasia. Camels thrived in North America before later dispersing to Asia. Rhinoceroses reached both giant and bizarre forms, including species taller than giraffes. The variety of grazers was staggering, matched by the diversity of predators that hunted them. In South America, the isolation of the continent led to unusual developments. Instead of the same kinds of grazers seen in the Old World, the plains were filled with creatures like giant rodents, litopterns, and notungulates, strange hoofed mammals unrelated to horses or antelope but occupying similar niches. Terror birds roamed as predators, filling roles that in other places were taken by cats or dogs. The grasslands of South America were a parallel world, similar in structure but utterly distinct in caste. Only later, when the Isthmus of Panama rose and connected the continents, would North American grazers and predators pour southward, transforming those ecosystems once again. The importance of grasslands extended beyond ecology into the evolution of entire lineages. The adaptations honed there, speed, endurance, sociality, grazing teeth, became the hallmarks of many modern mammals. Even today, our most iconic land animals are creatures of the grasslands: horses, bison, antelope, elephants, zebras. The evolutionary roots stretch back to this time when grasses first claimed the land. The rise of grasslands also set the stage for humans, though that would come much later. Early primates had thrived in forests, but as grasslands expanded, some lineages of apes and hominins would eventually adapt to life in more open environments. Walking upright, for example, may have been favoured by landscapes where trees were scattered rather than continuous. The story of humanity is tied, however distantly, to the spread of grasses and the animals that followed them. Looking back, the transformation from a forest-covered world to one of forests and grasslands was one of the great shifts of the Cenozoic. It changed not only the shape of landscapes, but the rhythm of life itself. Forests had been quiet, shadowed, layered. Grasslands were open, loud, filled with movement, with predators and prey visible from far away, with herds constantly on the move. It was a new kind of stage, and mammals adapted brilliantly to perform upon it. The rise of grasslands and grazers was not just about plants and animals, but about Earth itself evolving. The climate, the soils, the atmosphere, the circulation of nutrients, all were influenced by this shift. From small beginnings, grasses became one of the most powerful forces in shaping life on land, and the grazers that followed them became some of the most iconic animals in Earth's history, their herds thundering across plains that remain, even today, among the most vibrant ecosystems on the planet. If you stand back and look at Earth during the Cenozoic, you can't miss the way the continents themselves were part of the story. Animals and plants were busy evolving, climates were shifting, oceans were rising and falling, but beneath it all, the very stage they performed on was sliding, colliding and reshaping. It's easy to forget how much motion lies under our feet, but the Cenozoic was a time of grand rearrangements, the great shuffle that gave us the continents as we know them today. At the start of the era, about 66 million years ago, the map already looked closer to the modern arrangement than it had for most of Earth's history, but the details were still in flux. South America was a continent adrift, its land cut off from North America and Africa. Africa itself was moving northward toward Europe. India, racing north after its long isolation, was on a collision course with Asia. Australia was still linked to Antarctica, but slowly beginning to drift away. These motions sound slow, and they are, measured in inches per year, but over millions of years they add up to revolutions. One of the most dramatic collisions was India meeting Asia. By around 50 million years ago, the two landmasses struck, and the impact began to crumple the crust upward, giving birth to the Himalayas. This mountain range, still rising today, became one of the defining features of the planet. Alongside it, the Tibetan Plateau lifted skyward, creating one of the largest elevated regions on Earth. The rise of these mountains had effects that rippled far beyond their slopes. They altered wind patterns, reshaped monsoons, and changed the flow of rivers across Asia. The uplift also increased weathering of rocks, a process that draws carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which in turn contributed to the gradual cooling that marked the latter half of the Cenozoic. Africa's northward drift brought it into contact with Eurasia, closing off ancient seaways and reshaping the Mediterranean. The Tethys Sea, once a vast ocean separating the northern and southern continents, slowly narrowed as Africa pressed closer. Over time, parts of it vanished, replaced by mountains and inland seas. This collision set the stage for the Alps and other ranges across southern Europe and northern Africa. Each step of this shuffle closed old pathways for marine life and opened new land routes for animals to migrate. Australia's separation from Antarctica had equally profound consequences. As the two continents parted, ocean currents began to flow freely around Antarctica. This isolation allowed the continent to freeze, turning what had once been a lush forested land into the icy desert we know today. The Antarctic circumpolar current that developed around 34 million years ago became one of the most powerful climate regulators on the planet, locking Antarctica in ice and helping drive global cooling. That current still spins today, a reminder of how continental drift can change not just geography, but climate itself. South America, meanwhile, remained an island continent for much of the Cenozoic. Cut off from the north, it developed a caste of unique animals found nowhere else: giant sloths, armoured glyptodonts, terror birds, and odd-hoofed mammals. For tens of millions of years, these creatures evolved in isolation, a living experiment in parallel evolution. Only when the Isthmus of Panama rose around 3 million years ago did South America reconnect with North America, setting off one of the great biotic exchanges in history. Armadillos, opossums and porcupines marched north, while horses, cats and bears surged south. The shuffle of continents had opened a bridge, and life wasted no time in crossing it. North America itself was shifting too, as mountain building and volcanism reshaped its interior and west coast. The Rocky Mountains rose during the Paleocene and Eocene, while the Cascades and Sierra Nevada ranges developed later. These uplifts influenced rainfall, ecosystems, and even the course of mammal evolution on the continent. Grasslands spread in their rain shadows, rivers carved valleys, and new habitats opened for grazers and predators alike. The land itself was part of the story of adaptation. In the oceans, seaways opened and closed as continents moved, redirecting currents and redistributing heat. The closing of the Tethys, the separation of South America and Antarctica, the later closure of the Isthmus of Panama, all of these reorganized circulation patterns. When the isthmus closed, for instance, it shut off the connection between the Atlantic and Pacific, intensifying the Gulf Stream. That current carried warm water northward, fueling ice sheet growth in Greenland and helping to trigger the ice ages of the Pleistocene. The shuffle of land created the dance of currents, and the dance of currents steered the climate. Continental motion also triggered volcanism in key regions. As plates collided, subduction zones formed, giving rise to arcs of volcanoes that pumped gases into the atmosphere. These eruptions sometimes warmed the climate, sometimes cooled it by spewing ash and sulfur, and always reminded life that the solid ground beneath was not so solid after all. From the Andes in South America to the Cascades in North America to the volcanic fields of East Africa, the shuffle of plates built mountains and powered eruptions that shaped ecosystems on their flanks. The migration routes that opened and closed as continents moved played a huge role in the story of animals. When Africa collided with Eurasia, elephants and antelope spread north while carnivores moved south. When Australia drifted farther away, its marsupials remained isolated, creating the unique fauna that still characterizes the continent. When South America finally linked to the north, its distinct cast of animals faced new competition, and many of its ancient lineages disappeared. Each connection or separation acted like a gate, deciding which species would meet, compete, and continue. The shuffle even influenced the oceans at the smallest scales. As continents moved, they changed the chemistry of the seas by altering weathering, sedimentation, and nutrient flow. Rivers carried new minerals into the water, feeding plankton blooms that supported whales and fish. As mountains rose, rain fell differently, washing nutrients into some regions while drying others. The interplay between drifting continents, weathering rocks, and living seas was constant, a feedback loop that shaped climate and life. If you think about it, the Cenozoic is as much a story of geology as it is of biology. The mammals, birds, and forests we've been following didn't evolve in isolation. They evolved on a moving stage. The rise of the Himalayas cooled the planet and shaped monsoons. The freezing of Antarctica reshaped currents and helped drive ice ages. The closure of seaways redirected migrations and split ecosystems. Every evolutionary path we've traced so far was influenced by this deeper, slower motion beneath. Imagine standing on Earth 60 million years ago looking at a map that feels half familiar. Now picture the slow drift, the continents edging closer or farther, collisions raising mountains, rifts opening oceans, islands merging into larger masses. Imagine the changes that would follow. A tropical forest where now there is desert, a grassy steppe where now there is jungle, an icy expanse where once there were trees and crocodiles. That's the power of continental drift, not just to redraw maps, but to remake climates and ecosystems from the ground up. The great shuffle of continents during the Cenozoic created the world we know today. The Himalayas, the Andes, the Alps, the Rockies, the Sahara, the savannas of Africa, the grasslands of North America, all are products of this slow motion. The animals and plants that filled them evolved in response. Their history is inseparable from the motion of plates beneath. The shuffle continues even now, imperceptible in our lifetimes but relentless across deep time. And in the age of mammals, it was one of the quiet but decisive forces guiding the story of life. When the dinosaurs fell, it wasn't only the mammals that looked around and saw opportunity. Another group, their close relatives, stepped into spaces left open and began to explore them in strange and surprising ways. Birds, descendants of small feathered dinosaurs, had already been around for millions of years, but in the Cenozoic they diversified in ways that would have seemed almost impossible if you only knew them as the delicate sparrows and songbirds outside your window today. Some became enormous, flightless predators that stalked the land with terrifying efficiency. Others developed into forms that were downright odd, predators with teeth-like beaks or shapes that blurred the line between bird and beast. Alongside them, mammalian predators were also experimenting, producing lineages now long gone but once powerful enough to define entire ecosystems. It was a time when the very idea of what a predator could look like was up for negotiation. In South America, where isolation shaped life for tens of millions of years, the top hunters were not cats or dogs, but birds. These were the Forus racids, better known by the dramatic nickname terror birds. Some stood nearly 10 feet tall, towering over the mammals around them. With long legs built for running, strong necks, and massive hooked beaks, they were apex predators. Imagine one striding across a grassland, chasing down a small ungulate, pinning it with its feet and delivering bone-crushing blows with its beak. These birds had no need for wings. Their power came from their speed and striking force. For nearly 60 million years they dominated South America, a reign that lasted until the continent finally connected with the north and mammalian carnivores poured in. The terror birds weren't alone in their strangeness. Other giant birds also appeared in different parts of the world. In Europe during the Eocene, Gastornithids were the dominant giants. They weren't hunters in the same way as terror birds, but were nonetheless intimidating, with massive beaks that may have been used for cracking tough vegetation or intimidating smaller creatures. For a long time, scientists debated whether they were carnivores or herbivores, but either way, their size alone made them forces to be reckoned with. Predation in the Cenozoic wasn't only about birds. Mammalian predators were undergoing their own experiments. Before true carnivores like cats and dogs had fully taken hold, another lineage called creodonts ruled. They looked somewhat like wolves or hyenas, but belonged to a separate order entirely. Some were sleek and fast, others bulky and bone-crushing. They had sharp, slicing teeth, powerful jaws, and for tens of millions of years they were the top mammalian hunters in Africa, Asia, and North America. When you picture early mammals spreading into new niches, remember that the ones they feared most were often creodonts, strange predators with no modern counterparts. Later, other odd mammalian predators emerged. Andrewsarchus from the Eocene of Mongolia is known only from a giant skull, but what a skull it is. Nearly 3 feet long, with enormous jaws and teeth, it hints at an animal that may have been one of the largest land carnivorous mammals ever. Its exact appearance is uncertain, but it may have looked like a wolf crossed with a pig, with a massive head atop a heavy body. Whatever its form, it was a predator, or possibly a scavenger, that would have been terrifying to encounter. As time went on, true carnivorans began to take over the predator roles. Early dog-like and cat-like species appeared, refining the traits we recognize today: retractable claws, keen senses, stealth, and speed. But before they became dominant, the world was full of predators that looked nothing like them. Saber-toothed nimravids, not true cats but similar, evolved long blade-like canines and stocky builds for ambush hunting. Hyenalurids, massive creodont relatives, grew to lion-sized or bigger, prowling Africa and Eurasia. These animals blurred the lines between familiar and alien, predators that would seem almost imaginary if not for their fossils. Even marine predators had their share of odd shapes. Early whales, still learning how to be fully aquatic, developed long serpentine bodies or strange skull shapes. Basilosaurus, with its snake-like form, was unlike anything alive today, hunting fish and smaller whales with its elongated jaws. Sharks like Otodus and later Megalodon grew to sizes that made them the undisputed rulers of the seas, their toothy jaws wide enough to engulf large mammals. The oceans of the Cenozoic were not only full of grazers and gentle giants, but also predators of staggering scale. Back on land, the diversity of predators reflected the diversity of prey. As herbivores grew larger and faster in grasslands, predators adapted to chase them down. As forests persisted in some regions, ambush hunters thrived in the shadows. In isolated continents, entirely unique predator guilds formed. In South America, for example, besides terror birds, there were sparacodonts, marsupial carnivores unrelated to placental mammals but filling similar roles. Some looked like saber-toothed cats, others like dogs, but they were their own separate lineage, evolving in the absence of northern competition. For millions of years they were South America's answer to lions and wolves. What's striking about this age of predators is not just their variety but their transience. So many of them came and went, their lineages leaving no modern descendants. Creodonts vanished, terror birds disappeared, sparacodonts died out, Andrewsarchus and its kin left only mysteries. They were experiments, successful in their time but unable to outlast the shifts in climate, geography and competition that came later. Predation itself never disappeared, but the forms it took were constantly changing, a reminder of how fluid ecosystems can be. Imagine walking across a Miocene plain in South America. Herds of grazing mammals browse on grasses, while in the distance a massive bird with a hooked beak scans the horizon. Somewhere nearby, a spracodont lurks, a predator unlike anything in Africa or Eurasia. The air hums with insects, the ground shakes with the movement of herds, and every creature is alert for the sudden strike of a hunter. It was a world where the unexpected was normal, where predators came in feathers as often as in fur, and where evolution seemed willing to try every design imaginable. Predators of odd shapes remind us that survival isn't about looking familiar or fitting a pattern. It's about meeting the demands of the moment. Terror birds thrived because they could run down prey in open landscapes. Creodonts succeeded because their jaws and teeth made them efficient hunters in forests and plains. Saber-toothed nimravids carved out niches with their oversized canines. Each one was a solution to the challenges of its environment, and each one flourished until circumstances shifted. The age of mammals was not just about gentle grazers spreading across grasslands, or primates leaping through trees. It was also an age of strangeness, of predators that looked more like myths than reality. For millions of years, these birds and beasts were the ones that set the rules of survival. Their absence today makes the past feel more distant. But the fossils they left behind remind us that Earth's history is full of surprises, full of experiments in form and function that worked brilliantly for a time before vanishing forever. The story of the Cenozoic isn't complete without these predators. They were the counterbalance to the herds, the challenge to the browsers, the danger in the shadows and the open plains. They shaped how other animals lived, moved and evolved. And though most of them are gone, their echoes remain in the adaptations of modern predators, in the speed of antelopes, in the vigilance of herding animals, and in the landscapes they once ruled. When we talk about the rise of mammals, the spread of forests, or the great herds that thundered across new grasslands, it's easy to forget that all of it happened against a backdrop that was shifting and rising and crumpling beneath their feet. The surface of Earth is not fixed. It flows, buckles and collides, and during the Cenozoic those movements gave birth to some of the most dramatic landscapes the planet has ever seen. The mountains we know today, the great ranges that dominate continents and shape weather systems, largely owe their existence to the events of this era. The Himalayas, the Andes, the Rockies, the Alps, they were all sculpted or uplifted during this time, and their formation didn't just create scenery. It changed climates, steered the course of rivers, and even influenced the evolution of animals and plants. Take the Himalayas. At the dawn of the Cenozoic, India was not yet part of Asia. It had broken away from the ancient southern continent of Gondwana and drifted northward across the Indian Ocean, moving at what, in geological terms, was a breakneck pace. By about 50 million years ago, it slammed into the underside of Asia, and the collision began to pile up rock into what would become the world's tallest mountains. That collision hasn't ended. Even today, India continues to push into Asia, and the Himalayas rise a few millimeters higher each year. The violence of that impact created Everest, K2, and all the towering peaks that define the range. But the story isn't only about high summits. When mountains rise, they change the air around them. The Himalayas altered wind patterns across Asia, giving rise to the monsoons that now drench the subcontinent each summer. The uplift also exposed vast amounts of fresh rock to weathering. As rainwater and rivers broke down those rocks, they pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, sequestering it in sediments. Over millions of years, this chemical process helped draw down greenhouse gases and contributed to the cooling trend that shifted Earth from a greenhouse world toward the icehouse conditions of the later Cenozoic. In other words, the rise of the Himalayas didn't just change the skyline, it nudged the entire planet toward ice ages. The Andes tell a similar story on the far side of the globe. Along the western edge of South America, the oceanic Nazca Plate has been diving under the continent throughout the Cenozoic, pushing up the Andes and fueling a chain of volcanoes that still rumble today. This uplift created one of the longest mountain ranges in the world, stretching thousands of miles from Venezuela down to Patagonia. The Andes formed towering peaks and high plateaus like the Altiplano, reshaping the continent's ecosystems. Rainforests developed on the moist eastern slopes, deserts formed in the rain shadows to the west, and high-altitude habitats gave rise to llamas, vicuñas, and other unique animals adapted to thin air. The Andes also changed South America's rivers. The Amazon, which had once flowed westward into the Pacific, was blocked by rising mountains. Water pooled, forming massive wetlands, and eventually the drainage reversed, creating the modern eastward flow into the Atlantic. That reversal, driven by mountain building, shaped one of the richest ecosystems on the planet. The Amazon rainforest as we know it owes its very existence in part to the uplift of the Andes. In North America, the Rocky Mountains had already begun to rise by the end of the Cretaceous, but their story continued through the Cenozoic. The forces that built them were complex, involving shallow-angle subduction of oceanic crust under the continent. The uplift created dramatic ranges that stretched across the west, altering rainfall patterns and creating the arid basins and plains we know today. As the mountains rose, ecosystems adapted. Grasslands spread in the rain shadows while forests clung to wetter slopes. The Rockies became not just a physical barrier but an ecological boundary, shaping where animals could move and how climates developed. Europe saw its own upheaval as the African plate pressed north into Eurasia, closing the ancient Tethys Sea. That collision created the Alps, the Pyrenees and other ranges across southern Europe. The Alps, like the Himalayas, remain active, their peaks still rising as the plates grind against each other. These mountains influence the climates of Europe, creating wetter zones along their slopes and drier conditions behind them. For humans, much later, they became cultural boundaries and centres of settlement, but long before that they had already been shaping the paths of animals, rivers and forests. The making of mountains was not just about uplift, but also about volcanism. Along with the Andes, other volcanic arcs rose, including the Cascades in North America and the islands of the Pacific Ring of Fire. These volcanic mountains spewed gases and ash, sometimes cooling climates temporarily, sometimes enriching soils with minerals that supported lush forests. Volcanic activity was part of the mountain story, tying the deep movements of the Earth to the surface ecosystems that relied on them. The Tibetan Plateau, lifted alongside the Himalayas, deserves special mention. It is sometimes called the roof of the world, a vast expanse of high-altitude land nearly the size of Western Europe. Its rise changed atmospheric circulation profoundly. Winds flowing over its height steered moisture across Asia, strengthening the monsoons and shaping deserts like the Gobi to the north. The plateau also became a cradle for unique species adapted to thin air and cold, from snow leopards to wild yaks. For millions of years it has been one of the most influential landforms on the planet, not only in geography but in global climate. The story of mountain building during the Cenozoic is written in fossils too. As ranges rose, they created barriers that split populations. Animals and plants separated by mountains evolved along different paths, leading to new species. Isolation in valleys or on slopes encouraged diversity, while the varied climates of mountain landscapes created countless niches. The very act of lifting rock into the sky drove evolution by reshaping habitats. Mountains also influenced rivers, and rivers in turn influenced life. The Indus, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Amazon, the Mississippi, all of these great rivers were steered, altered or fed by mountain building during the Cenozoic. They carried sediments to the seas, built fertile floodplains, and carved canyons that became homes to unique ecosystems. In every case, the link between mountains and life was direct. If you had flown over Earth 50 million years ago, you would have seen continents still shifting into place, but the outlines of today's ranges beginning to rise. Another flight 20 million years ago would show the Himalayas towering, the Andes stretching their length, the Alps cresting in Europe. Another flight 2 million years ago would reveal glaciers scouring those peaks, ice grinding against rock, carving valleys and cirques that shaped the mountains we hike today. The making of mountains has never truly ended. It continues quietly beneath us, a process far larger and slower than human timescales. These mountains were not only sculptors of climate and ecosystems, they were also keepers of time. Within their rocks lie fossils of ancient seas, records of vanished forests, clues to climates long gone. Each uplift exposed new layers, revealing pages of Earth's history to those who could read them. They are both the products of deep time and the archives of it, built by collisions yet telling stories millions of years older. The Cenozoic was the age not only of mammals but of landscapes reshaped. The Himalayas rose to dominate Asia, the Andes stretched the spine of South America, the Rockies towered across North America, the Alps lifted over Europe. Each range was more than stone. Each became a force that guided winds, rivers, climates, and lives. Without them, the course of evolution would have looked entirely different. The great shuffle of continents provided the motion, and mountain building provided the drama. Together, they created the world we recognise today. The early Cenozoic had been a greenhouse world, a planet wrapped in warmth, where forests reached into the polar latitudes and crocodiles swam in northern rivers. But that warmth was not permanent. Over tens of millions of years, the balance of Earth's climate began to tip. What had been a lush, nearly universal green slowly gave way to sharper contrasts. Dry regions where rain once fell freely, grasslands where forests had dominated, and eventually ice where none had existed for tens of millions of years. It was a slow, uneven transformation, punctuated by sudden events, but the long arc of the story was clear. Earth was cooling, and the winds of change were sweeping across continents and oceans alike. The first signs appeared in the Eocene, after the great thermal maximum had passed. Temperatures began to drift downward, not drastically at first, but enough to signal a shift. By about 34 million years ago, at the boundary between the Eocene and the Oligocene, the change accelerated. The cooling was not a simple accident. It was driven by forces deep within the Earth, by continents sliding into new positions, by mountains rising skyward, and by currents in the oceans changing their paths. When Antarctica finally broke away from South America and Australia, a dramatic transformation followed. For the first time, a current could spin uninterrupted around the southern pole, isolating Antarctica from warmer waters. This Antarctic circumpolar current locked the continent into a deep freeze. Glaciers grew and spread, covering land that had once been forested. Within a relatively short time in geological terms, Antarctica shifted from green to white, a transformation so complete that its forests and animals were wiped away. The frozen continent we know today was born in that moment, and its ice became one of the central players in Earth's climate. The Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, rising higher each million years, added their own influence. The exposed rock of those new mountains weathered quickly, pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. As rain and wind broke down minerals, the chemical reactions locked greenhouse gases into sediments and washed them into the seas. Less carbon dioxide meant less heat trapped in the atmosphere, a long-term cooling effect that worked hand in hand with the isolation of Antarctica. These two forces, plate tectonics and atmospheric chemistry, teamed up to push the planet steadily toward an icehouse state. The Oligocene world looked very different from the Eocene that came before it. Forests retreated in many places, grasslands spread, and climates became more seasonal. Animals adapted to the new rhythms. Herbivores developed new teeth for grazing, predators adjusted to open environments, and birds and insects shifted their ranges. The cooling didn't mean life retreated, but it did mean life had to change, and those changes left marks that still shape ecosystems today. By the Miocene, cooling continued, though it was punctuated by intervals of warmth. Grasslands spread more widely, supporting vast herds of grazers and the predators that followed them. Africa dried in many regions, transforming what had once been continuous forests into mosaics of woodland and savanna. That shift had profound consequences for primates. whose ancestors had lived comfortably in trees but now found themselves navigating more open landscapes. The seeds of our own lineage's adaptations were sown in those shifting climates. Meanwhile, ice continued its march. In Antarctica, glaciers thickened, spreading across the continent and locking away vast amounts of water. Sea levels dropped as ice accumulated, reshaping coastlines around the world. By the later Miocene and into the Pliocene, Greenland too began to freeze, adding another high-latitude ice sheet to the planetary system. The poles had become true engines of climate, their frozen masses reflecting sunlight, cooling the air, and reinforcing the downward slide in global temperatures. The winds of change blew not only across land but through the seas. As ice expanded and continents shifted, ocean currents reorganized. The closure of the Tethys Sea as Africa pressed into Eurasia, the narrowing of passages in Central America, and the uplift of mountain ranges all redirected water. These changes in turn altered how heat was distributed around the globe. When the Isthmus of Panama finally rose around 3 million years ago, it shut off the flow between the Atlantic and Pacific. The intensified Gulf Stream carried warm water northward, feeding snowfall in the Arctic and accelerating the growth of ice sheets. A chain of geological accidents had created the conditions for the ice ages. The animals of the cooling world reflected the new reality. Mammoths, mastodons, and woolly rhinos evolved to survive in colder climates. Thick fur, fat layers, and behaviours like migration and huddling helped them thrive in regions where cold became the dominant force. Saber-toothed cats and dire wolves hunted them, themselves adapted to the cycles of glacial and interglacial worlds. In Africa, hominins were beginning their own journey, shaped by landscapes that were no longer endless forests, but shifting mixtures of woodland, grassland, and arid zones. The cooling world was not steady. Temperatures rose and fell, sometimes sharply, as feedback loops pushed the climate one way and then the other. Ice expanded, then retreated, then grew again. Rainfall shifted, deserts advanced and withdrew, coastlines moved back and forth. For the animals living through it, the earth was never still. They moved with the climates, migrating to follow food, adapting to new habitats, or vanishing when the changes proved too great. What stands out in this long story is how the pieces fit together. Mountains rose, rocks weathered, carbon dioxide fell. Continents drifted, currents shifted, poles froze. Life adjusted, evolved, and spread into new forms. The cooling world was not a simple matter of less sunlight or colder air. It was a global machine, with each part pushing another. The Himalayas fed the rivers pulled carbon, the carbon altered the sky cooled the earth, the ice spread, and the ice reshaped the oceans. The cycle was vast and interconnected, and every creature, from grazing horses to early humans, felt its pull. If you could stand in the Miocene and look around, you would see grassland stretching far, herds moving across open plains, predators stalking them with new strategies suited to the openness. To the south, Africa's forests would be patchier, and the first hominins might be testing life on the ground as much as in the trees. Far to the south, Antarctica would already be locked in ice, its glaciers grinding rock, carving icebergs, and chilling the seas. The Earth was still alive with warmth and movement, but the direction of change was clear. The greenhouse had given way to the icehouse, and the age of ice had begun to knock at the door. The winds of change carried with them not only cold but possibility. They created new habitats, drove evolution in fresh directions, and set the stage for the dramatic ice ages of the Pleistocene. They also remind us that climates are never fixed, that Earth shifts between modes over deep time, and that life must always adapt to the currents of air and water that move unseen but relentless around the globe. By the time the Earth had cooled enough to grow its first great ice sheets, and the forests had given way to wide grasslands in many regions, the shapes of the animals walking across those landscapes began to look familiar. The Cenozoic had started with odd creatures that looked half experimental, mammals with blunt teeth or strange horns or awkward proportions, birds that resembled monsters more than sparrows. But as millions of years passed and ecosystems shifted, a clearer picture began to emerge, one that feels closer to the world we know. It was in the Miocene and Pliocene especially that the first glimpses of modern animals appeared. You could walk into those landscapes and, though you would still see plenty of strangeness, you would also recognise forms that look like elephants, horses, cats, antelope, even apes. Horses are one of the clearest examples. In the early Eocene, their ancestors were tiny forest dwellers, barely the size of a small dog with multiple toes that spread their weight over soft ground. They browsed on leaves, slipping quietly through undergrowth. But as the forests retreated and grassland spread, horses transformed. Their teeth changed, becoming high-crowned and durable, able to handle the abrasive grind of silica-rich grasses. Their legs elongated, and their toes reduced until only a single hoof bore their weight. By the Miocene, horses were sleek runners built for speed across open plains, and though they came in many shapes and sizes, their overall form is instantly recognisable. If you saw a Miocene horse herd moving across the grass, you'd know immediately what you were looking at, even if their proportions seemed just a little different. Elephants, too, began to take on the forms we know. Their early ancestors, like Muratherium, looked more like hippos than giants, with small tusks and semi-aquatic habits. Over time, though, their lineages split and grew. By the Miocene, proboscideans had become larger, their tusks longer, and their trunks more prominent. Some had straight tusks, others spiraled, and their teeth evolved into the massive grinding molars that allowed them to feed on tough vegetation. While not yet the exact elephants we know today, they were clearly on that path, and if you stood beside one, you would recognise the lineage without question. The great cats were beginning their reign as well. Earlier predators had included nimrovids and creodonts, but by the Miocene, true felids had evolved. They were smaller at first, resembling lynxes or leopards, but their retractable claws, sharp senses, and powerful builds marked them as unmistakable cats. Alongside them, the saber-toothed cats of the Machairodontinae subfamily began to develop their famous elongated canines, creating a lineage of predators that would dominate for millions of years. These cats are so iconic that we often think of them as belonging to a world entirely different from ours, yet their bodies and behaviours would be immediately familiar to anyone who has ever watched a lion or tiger stalk prey. Dogs too were beginning to spread. From their North American origins, canids evolved into forms resembling wolves, foxes and jackals. They had long legs built for pursuit and pack hunting, traits that allowed them to thrive on the open grasslands. By the Pliocene, early wolves were chasing prey in groups, honing strategies that would later make their descendants some of the most adaptable predators on Earth. The predator guild was shifting toward the one we know, shaped by speed, endurance, and cooperation. The smaller mammals also began to resemble the modern caste. Rodents, already successful since the Paleocene, diversified even more, producing lineages that look much like today's squirrels, mice, and beavers. Rabbits appeared, quick and prolific, filling niches in grasslands and forests alike. Bats continued their success in the skies, their fossil forms from this period almost indistinguishable from those of modern species. Even the insectivores, the shrews and moles, carried their basic forms forward with little change. Proof that some body plans, once perfected, needed little adjustment. Birds had long been a part of the Cenozoic scene, but now many of the lineages that dominate today were taking shape. Songbirds began to spread, filling forests and grasslands with calls and trills. Waterfowl diversified, their bodies suited for lakes, rivers and coastlines. Raptors too expanded, with hawks, eagles and owls honing the same hunting strategies we see now. While some giant birds still stalked continents, the overall avian picture was becoming one we would recognise. a sky filled with wings that look much like those that cross our skies today. The apes and monkeys of the Miocene provide perhaps the most profound connection to us. During this time, primates spread widely across Africa, Europe and Asia. Monkeys diversified into Old World and New World forms, each with their distinct traits. Apes grew in variety, with some lineages producing large-bodied species that swung through trees or walked on the ground. Fossil evidence shows a rich array of forms, many now extinct, but within them lay the seeds of modern gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees and eventually humans. To see a Miocene ape might feel uncanny, as if looking into a mirror that reflects both the familiar and the unfamiliar. Marine life also revealed early glimpses of the modern. Whales had already become fully aquatic by this time, and during the Miocene they diversified into baleen whales and toothed whales. Some baleen whales grew to enormous sizes, using their fringed plates to filter krill and plankton just as blue whales do today. Dolphins appeared, agile and intelligent, filling coastal waters with clicks and whistles. Seals, sea lions and walruses became established, their bodies streamlined for life between land and sea. Manatees and dugongs grazed in shallow waters, shaping seagrass ecosystems. The seas of the Miocene would not feel alien to us. They would feel like a different version of the oceans we know. Sharks continued to thrive, and in the Miocene one species in particular reached legendary status. Megalodon, the giant shark, grew to lengths of more than 50 feet. With teeth the size of a human hand, it preyed on whales and other large marine animals. For millions of years it was the undisputed apex predator of the seas. Though extinct now, its presence gave the Miocene oceans a sense of drama and danger that resonates even today. What makes this period striking is the blend of the familiar and the strange. A Miocene savanna might show herds of horses and antelope-like animals grazing, much as they do in Africa today. Predators like cats and dogs would stalk them, their movements instantly recognizable. Birds would fill the air with song, and rodents would dart through the grass. But alongside them would be creatures unlike anything alive now. Elephants with spiraled tusks, rhinos taller than giraffes, giant pig-like beasts, and apes that looked familiar but were not quite us. It was a world half modern, half experimental, a preview of what was to come. The making of modern animals was not just about appearance, but also about behaviour. Herding, migration, complex social structures, cooperative hunting, and territorial defence all became more prominent. These strategies were responses to grasslands, seasonal climates, and the challenges of open habitats. They created animals that were not only physically familiar, but behaviourally familiar too. Watching them would feel like watching the origins of the dramas that still play out across the Serengeti or Yellowstone today. By the Pliocene, just a few million years ago, the picture had sharpened even more. Many animals alive then would be recognisable to us now. Early elephants roamed Africa, true horses galloped across the plains, big cats hunted with stealth, wolves tracked in packs, deer grazed in forests, and birds sang across continents. Even hominins, our own ancestors, had appeared, walking upright on the African landscape. The line between ancient and modern was growing thin. The first glimpses of modern animals remind us that the present is not separate from the past. The creatures we see today carry with them the legacy of millions of years of adaptation, survival and change. Their forms did not appear suddenly but were shaped step by step, tooth by tooth, stride by stride through the long experiments of the Cenozoic. To see a Miocene savanna or a Pliocene coastline would be to see the rehearsal for our modern world. A cast still shifting but already recognisable, already familiar. When people think of the Cenozoic, they often imagine mammoths roaming icy plains or saber-toothed cats stalking herds. But another story was quietly unfolding in the shadows of forests, on the branches of trees, and later on the open ground. It's the story of primates, a lineage that began as small, wide-eyed survivors of the asteroid impact and, over tens of millions of years, grew into the diverse family that includes lemurs, monkeys, apes, and eventually us. The early hints of our own existence can be traced back to those fragile beginnings, long before any creature walked upright or chipped stone tools. Right after the extinction of the dinosaurs, the forests of the Paleocene filled with new life. Among the small mammals scurrying through branches were the first primate-like creatures, tiny animals with grasping hands and feet, flexible joints, and forward-facing eyes. These traits gave them advantages in the trees, where depth perception meant safety from falls and agility meant catching insects or plucking fruit. They were not yet true primates in the modern sense, but part of a broader group called Plesiadapiforms. Some looked like squirrels with long fingers, others resembled lemurs, and their diversity showed that the path toward primates was already branching out. By the Eocene, around 56 million years ago, true primates had appeared. Fossils from this time show animals like Adaepis and Notharctus, creatures with large eyes, grasping hands and nails instead of claws. They were small, many no bigger than a house cat, and their lives revolved around the dense forest that still blanketed much of the world. These early primates split into two major groups, one leading toward lemurs and lorises, the other toward monkeys and apes. The split remains one of the deepest divisions in primate evolution, and it happened at a time when Earth was warm, tropical forests stretched far, and the night and day were both full of opportunity. The eyes of these early primates tell much of the story. Many were nocturnal, with huge sockets that housed eyes adapted to low light. In the dark, they could leap from branch to branch, hunting insects or reaching fruit without falling. Others were diurnal, awake during the day, using colour vision to pick out ripe fruits and young leaves. The ability to see in colour, which many mammals had lost in earlier evolutionary stages, was retained in primates and became a crucial advantage in forest life. That sense, still vital to us, began as a way to survive among the greenery of the Eocene. As the Oligocene brought cooler climates and forests began to shrink in some regions, primates adapted again. In Africa and Asia, new forms appeared that were more robust and specialised. Monkeys with tails evolved to navigate both trees and ground, while the ancestors of apes began to develop broader chests, stronger shoulders, and more flexible arms. Fossils from sites in Egypt, such as Fayum, show an incredible array of species, from tiny insect eaters to larger fruit eaters. These were the foundations of the primate families that would spread across the old world and eventually into our own lineage. The Miocene was a golden age for apes. From about 20 million to 5 million years ago, dozens of ape species roamed Africa, Europe, and Asia. Some were small and agile, swinging through trees, while others were massive ground dwellers. Proconsul in Africa, Dryopithecus in Europe, Civipithecus in Asia. Each of these apes reveals experiments in form and behaviour. Some looked more like monkeys with flexible backs, others had faces that resemble modern orangutans, and still others combined features in ways that don't match any living species. The diversity was astonishing, and for a time, apes were far more varied than they are today. Among these Miocene apes, we find the earliest hints of what would eventually lead to us. Fossils show changes in teeth, jaws, and posture that suggest some species were experimenting with different diets and different ways of moving. The transition from knuckle walking or tree swinging toward more upright postures was beginning, even if slowly. The environmental pressures of the Miocene, expanding grasslands, shifting forests, cooler climates, pushed some apes out of their arboreal comfort zones. Those that adapted survived, and those that didn't vanished. The winnowing of this diversity would eventually leave only a handful of ape lineages, but among them was the one that would lead to humans. It's important to remember that primate evolution wasn't a straight line. For every ancestor that carried traits toward us, dozens of cousins flourished for a time and then disappeared. Gigantopithecus in Asia grew to enormous size, possibly 10 feet tall, but did not survive beyond a few 100,000 years ago. Oreopithecus lived in Italy with unusual adaptations for both climbing and walking, then disappeared. countless species came and went, leaving only fragments of their bones to remind us that the primate family tree was once far bushier than the one we see today. While apes explored new forms, monkeys found great success in their own right. Old World monkeys, with downward-facing nostrils and strong social structures, spread across Africa and Asia. New World monkeys, carried across the Atlantic on rafts of vegetation from Africa, established themselves in South America, evolving into howler monkeys, spider monkeys, and capuchins. Their tails, often prehensile, gave them an advantage in trees, and their playful behaviours filled forests with energy. The success of monkeys alongside apes shows that primates were not bound to a single trajectory, but adapted to every niche that opened. By the late Miocene and into the Pliocene, around 6 to 7 million years ago, a profound split occurred. Somewhere in Africa, a lineage of apes diverged from the ancestors of modern chimpanzees and gorillas. That lineage would become hominins, the group that includes us and our extinct relatives. The earliest known hominins, like Sahelanthropus, Orrorin, and Ardipithecus, showed the first evidence of upright walking, with hips, legs, and spines adjusting to a new way of moving. They still climbed trees and lived in mixed habitats, but their ability to walk on two legs marked a turning point. It was the first step toward the long road of human evolution. Walking upright brought new possibilities. It freed the hands for carrying food, tools, or infants. It allowed greater visibility over tall grasses. It made long-distance travel more efficient in open landscapes. Each of these advantages tied to the environments of the time, when Africa's forests were breaking into mosaics of woodland and savanna. The early hints of humanity were not inventions of intelligence alone, but responses to the world around them, the same way that the teeth of horses or the tusks of elephants reflected their own changing habitats. Alongside upright walking came changes in the brain. Fossils of early hominins show slight increases in cranial capacity, not yet the large brains of later humans, but enough to suggest greater complexity. Social behaviours likely grew more intricate, with communication, cooperation, and even rudimentary tool use beginning to appear. These were small steps, invisible in any single generation but monumental across deep time. The story of primates in the Cenozoic is a story of persistence. From tiny nocturnal insect hunters to great apes experimenting with size and form, from playful monkeys swinging through South American forests to the first hominins taking cautious steps on two legs, the lineage adapted again and again. Each stage left traces of what would eventually shape us. Forward-facing eyes, dexterous hands, social bonds, curiosity, intelligence. Long before humans emerged, the ingredients of humanity were already simmering in the primate world. If you could walk into an Oligocene forest and see a small primate dart through the branches, or stand in the Miocene and watch a group of apes forage at the edge of a woodland, you would be looking at our story in its earliest chapters. They would not recognize us, and we might not recognize them as kin, but the connection would be there, written in their movements, their faces, their behaviours. The early hints of us were already present, waiting for the right conditions, the right pressures, and the right twists of evolution to bring them forward. The Cenozoic was full of strange creatures that came and went, but the primates endured. They tell us that our presence here is not an accident of a few thousand years, but the result of tens of millions of years of survival, adaptation, and chance. The story of primates is the story of persistence through changing climates, of grasping branches in the dark and walking upright in the sun, of intelligence growing step by step until it could look back and ask where it began. By the time the Cenozoic had stretched into its later chapters, the Earth had cooled enough that ice was no longer a rare visitor. It had become a regular, powerful presence, one that advanced and retreated in great rhythms across the Northern Hemisphere. These ice ages, beginning a little over 2.5 million years ago, were not single events but cycles, pulses of climate that alternated between cold glacial periods and warmer interglacials. They shaped the landscapes we know today, carved valleys, sculpted mountains, and forced life to move, adapt, or disappear. The Ice Ages were more than just cold weather. They were the heartbeat of the late Cenozoic, and their rhythm set the stage for the rise of humanity. The mechanics of these cycles begin with the tilt, wobble, and orbit of the Earth itself. The planet doesn't move around the Sun in a perfect circle. Its orbit shifts slightly over time, sometimes more circular, sometimes more elliptical. The angle of the Earth's tilt changes too, as does the slow wobble of its axis. These three factors, eccentricity, obliquity, and precession, interact in complex patterns, altering how much sunlight reaches different parts of the globe at different times. When the cycles align to reduce summer warmth in the northern hemisphere, ice sheets can grow because winter snow doesn't melt completely. Over tens of thousands of years, these small shifts accumulate and glaciers advance. When the cycles shift again, summers grow stronger, ice melts back, and interglacial warmth returns. This dance of orbital mechanics, known as the Milankovitch cycles, is subtle on a yearly basis but profound over deep time. Starting around 2.6 million years ago, the cycles tipped the Earth into a new regime where ice expanded repeatedly across North America, Europe and Asia. Each glacial period could last tens of thousands of years, covering vast areas with kilometers of ice. Then, in a geological instant, warmth would return, the ice would retreat, and rivers would roar with meltwater. This pattern repeated again and again, at first with shorter cycles of about 40,000 years, later dominated by longer cycles of about 100,000 years. The Ice Ages left their mark everywhere. In North America, glaciers carved the Great Lakes, scraped out valleys, and left behind moraines, eskers and drumlins that still define the landscape. In Europe, ice covered Scandinavia, pushed south into Germany and Poland, and shaped the fjords of Norway. In Asia, glaciers spread across Siberia and into the Himalayas. Even in regions not directly covered by ice, the climate was transformed. Winds carried dust across continents, deserts expanded, and grasslands spread as forests retreated. The very face of the planet was moulded by the advance and retreat of ice. For animals, the Ice Ages were both a challenge and an opportunity. Some lineages evolved to thrive in cold climates, growing thick coats of fur, layers of fat, and behaviours suited to freezing conditions. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, musk oxen, and reindeer became icons of the Ice Age world. Others adapted to the shifting climates by becoming more mobile, migrating with the seasons or following shifting habitats. Still others could not cope and vanished, their fossils buried beneath layers of ice and soil. Extinction and adaptation went hand in hand with every pulse of the glaciers. Predators adapted too. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and cave lions hunted the great herds of herbivores that moved across steppe-like grasslands. Their power, speed, and cooperative strategies made them effective hunters in environments where prey was large, wary, and constantly on the move. Smaller predators like foxes and lynxes found niches in the margins, thriving where they could. The balance between predator and prey was tight, both shaped by the cold rhythms of the age. The Ice Ages were not globally uniform. While northern continents froze under massive glaciers, other regions experienced different effects. In Africa, ice never spread, but the shifting climates altered rainfall patterns dramatically. Forests shrank, savannas expanded, and deserts grew and shrank with the cycles. For primates, including early hominins, these changes were profound. The landscapes they lived in were never stable, forcing them to adapt to new conditions again and again. Some of the key steps in human evolution, walking upright, using tools, forming larger social groups, were likely influenced by this constant environmental instability. The Ice Ages shaped not only the animals of the north, but the very origins of humanity in the south. The rhythms of the ice also influenced the seas. When glaciers expanded, they locked away vast amounts of water, lowering sea levels by as much as 100 meters. Coastlines extended far outward, exposing continental shelves that are now underwater. Land bridges appeared, connecting regions that are now separated by seas. During these times, animals and even early humans could migrate across Beringia from Asia to North America, or across dry channels into islands that later became isolated. When the ice melted, seas rose again, drowning those bridges and reshaping coastlines. The rise and fall of the oceans was part of the pulse of the ice ages, and life moved with it. The climate shifts were not gentle transitions. They were often abrupt, with warming events that transformed environments within decades or centuries. For the animals and humans alive then, change could come quickly. Forests might appear where there had been grasslands, rivers might swell or dry, and prey might vanish or shift its range. Adaptability was the key to survival, and those who could not adjust were left behind. The unpredictability of these changes may have been as significant as the cold itself in shaping evolution. One of the striking features of the ice ages is how recent they feel. The last glacial maximum when ice reached its peak was only about 20,000 years ago. In the scope of Earth's history, that is a blink. The retreat that followed shaped the world we live in. As the glaciers melted, they left behind fertile soils that supported agriculture. They carved river valleys that became homes to civilizations. They filled basins that became lakes. The landscapes humans settled and farmed were gifts of the ice ages, sculpted by cycles long before written history. The ice ages also remind us that climate is never static. The Earth has swung between warm and cold many times, and life has always had to adjust. The rhythms of the ice were particularly dramatic, though, because they occurred during a time when animals were already large, complex and widespread, and when humans were emerging. The cycles influenced not just ecosystems, but the trajectory of our own species, shaping migrations, survival strategies, and even the spread of culture. If you could watch the ice ages play out in time-lapse, you'd see the white sheets advance, grinding across continents, then melt back, rivers bursting with water, forests returning, animals moving with the shifts. Then the cycle would repeat, again and again, a planetary heartbeat measured in tens of thousands of years. To the creatures living through it, the changes would feel unpredictable and immense. To us, looking back, the pattern is clear, a rhythm written in ice cores, sediments and fossils. The great ice ages were not just cold periods. They were engines of change, sculptors of landscapes, and shapers of life. They remind us that the present, with its temperate climates and stable coastlines, is only a brief interglacial, a pause between glaciers. The Earth is still part of those rhythms, even if the future will unfold differently because of what we add to the atmosphere. The story of the Cenozoic cannot be told without the ice, for its cycles defined the closing chapters of the era and set the stage for the world we inherited. When the great ice sheets spread and retreated in their long cycles, they didn't only carve valleys and redirect rivers, they also created a stage for some of the most spectacular animals the world has ever seen. The late Cenozoic was the age of the megafauna, the giants that roamed across plains, forests and tundra, often in herds so large they shook the ground. Mammoths with spiralling tusks, mastodons with thick coats, woolly rhinos, cave bears, ground sloths as tall as small houses, armoured glyptodonts with shells like living tanks, enormous marsupial lions, and birds taller than a man. All of them belonged to this extraordinary caste. They were beasts that feel almost mythical to us now. Too big, too bold, as if the Earth briefly indulged in exaggeration before returning to the smaller forms we know today. These animals weren't strange accidents. They were products of the environment shaped by ice, grass, and shifting climates. In open landscapes, size offered advantages, protection from predators, the ability to travel long distances, and the capacity to survive lean times by storing energy in fat or sheer body mass. In colder regions, bulk helped conserve heat, and in ecosystems built on grasslands and seasonal productivity, large herbivores could graze widely, moving in patterns that reshaped the land itself. The Ice Age world wasn't just a backdrop for these animals, it demanded them. The mammoths are among the most famous. Descended from earlier proboscideans, they adapted brilliantly to the cold steppes of Eurasia and North America. Their woolly coats, layers of fat, and curved tusks made them symbols of the Pleistocene. They travelled in herds, feeding on grasses and shrubs, digging through snow with their tusks to reach food in winter. Some species were enormous, taller than modern elephants, while others were smaller, adapted to harsher conditions or island habitats. The frozen carcasses found in Siberia, with flesh and hair still intact, give us a hauntingly clear glimpse of their world, as if the ice itself refused to let them go entirely. Mastodons were their cousins, but distinct. Where mammoths favoured grasslands, mastodons preferred forests, browsing on branches, leaves and conifers. Their teeth were built for crushing rather than grinding, and their bodies were stocky and powerful. They ranged widely across North America, filling a role different from their mammoth relatives but equally vital. To see a mastodon in its forested home would have been to watch an animal both familiar and alien, a reminder that the elephant family once stretched across nearly every continent. Rhinos also reached spectacular forms. In Eurasia, woolly rhinos grazed on cold steppes, their long hair and thick hides insulating them against the cold. In earlier times, giants like Paraceratherium, the largest land mammal ever to walk the earth, roamed Asia, standing over 15 feet tall at the shoulder and stretching nearly 40 feet in length. It dwarfed even modern elephants. It browsed from the tops of trees, shaping entire forests by its presence. Though it lived millions of years before the peak of the Ice Ages, it belongs in the story of megafauna because it shows just how far mammals could push the boundaries of size. South America, isolated for much of the Cenozoic, produced its own caste of giants. Ground sloths, some towering over 20 feet tall, lumbered across its plains and forests. They could rear up on hind legs to strip branches, using massive claws to pull down vegetation. Glyptodonts, relatives of armadillos, evolved into creatures the size of small cars, their armoured shells protecting them from predators. Terror birds, long after their heyday, still stalk the continent, their hooked beaks ready to strike. When the land bridge to North America finally opened, many of these creatures spread northward, adding their weight to an already crowded stage of giants. Australia's isolation led to yet another unique set of megafauna. Marsupials filled niches that elsewhere were occupied by placental mammals. Diprotodons, giant relatives of wombats, reached sizes larger than modern rhinoceroses. Kangaroos grew taller than any living species today, with some standing over 10 feet. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, was not large compared to mammoths or rhinos, but it was a formidable predator with strong jaws and slicing teeth. Giant birds like Genyornis wandered the continent, while enormous reptiles still lingered in some regions. Australia's megafauna were a world apart, shaped by isolation and climate, yet they too followed the late Cenozoic pattern of gigantism. Predators grew to match the scale of their prey. Saber-toothed cats with their long curved canines hunted large herbivores with ambush strategies. Dire wolves, larger and heavier than modern wolves, hunted in packs across the Americas. Cave bears, massive and powerful, dominated European landscapes. Lions, leopards, jaguars and hyenas expanded their ranges, honing their hunting strategies on prey that required strength, coordination and endurance. The Ice Age world was not a gentle place. It was a landscape of giants where survival meant constant adaptation to size, strength, and shifting climates. What's striking is not only how large these animals were, but how diverse. Every continent hosted its own version of giants, and often multiple lineages reached massive proportions simultaneously. It wasn't just one or two species breaking the mould. It was a global phenomenon, a pattern repeated again and again. Scientists still debate exactly why gigantism was so common. Climate, productivity, predator-prey dynamics, and evolutionary chance all played roles. But whatever the reasons, the result was a world unlike ours, full of creatures so immense they seem more like legends than history. The presence of these animals also shaped the landscapes around them. Herds of mammoths and bison trampled vegetation, maintaining open grasslands. Ground sloths broke branches and altered forests. Glyptodonts dug and disturbed soil. Predators culled the weak and shaped the behaviour of prey. The megafauna weren't just passive residents of the Ice Age world. They were active engineers of ecosystems, altering the balance of plants and animals in ways we're only beginning to understand. For humans, these giants were both danger and resource. Early hunters encountered them across Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas. Cave paintings show mammoths, bison, and rhinos etched onto stone walls, evidence of how deeply they filled the imaginations of our ancestors. Bones with cut marks show that humans hunted them, sometimes driving herds into traps or ambushes. Their meat, hides, and bones provided food, shelter, and tools. For thousands of years, people lived alongside these giants, shaping their own survival strategies in relation to them. And yet, within the last 10 to 15,000 years, most of the megafauna vanished. The reasons remain debated. Climate change at the end of the last ice age altered habitats, shrinking the cold steppes and expanding forests and wetlands. Human hunting added new pressure, especially in regions where animals had not evolved alongside people and had little fear of them. Disease, ecosystem disruption, and multiple overlapping factors may all have contributed. Whatever the cause, the result was stark. Mammoths disappeared from most of their range. Mastodons fell silent. Giant sloths collapsed. Glyptodonts vanished. Diprotodons and giant kangaroos disappeared, and saber-toothed cats and dire wolves joined them. What remains today are fragments of that world. Elephants are the last great proboscideans, carrying echoes of mammoths and mastodons. Rhinoceroses survive in reduced numbers, shadows of their enormous ancestors. Bison, moose, and elk hint at the scale of past herds, though smaller now. Lions and tigers are kings of today's predators, but smaller than the saber-tooths and cave lions they replace. Even the few surviving giants remind us that the Ice Age world was once richer, wilder, more extravagant than ours. To walk into a Pleistocene plain would have been to step into a world of movement and scale we can barely imagine. Herds of mammoths stretching to the horizon, predators circling, birds wheeling overhead, sloths reaching higher than your head even while crouched. It was a world where animals seemed to defy proportion, where survival meant existing alongside forces of flesh and bone that towered over everything. To us now, it seems impossible that such creatures were once real, and yet their bones, tusks, and frozen bodies insist they were. The megafauna remind us that the Earth has allowed for extremes, and that life can push its boundaries again and again. They were not mistakes or curiosities. They were natural responses to the environments of the late Cenozoic, creatures perfectly suited to their time. Too big for our world, perhaps, but not too big for theirs. They belong to the story of the Cenozoic as much as forests, grasslands, or ice, and their absence leaves a silence that lingers even now. For tens of millions of years, the rhythms of climate, the slow drift of continents, the rise of mountains, and the dance of evolution had shaped the course of the Cenozoic. Forests expanded and shrank, grasslands spread, ice sheets advanced and retreated, and waves of animals rose to dominance before fading away. Through it all, life adapted, adjusted, and carried forward. But then, within just the most recent sliver of that vast timeline, a new force arrived. Small at first, fragile, not nearly as fast as the predators that roam the plains, nor as strong as the great herds of megafauna, humans nonetheless became a factor unlike any the planet had seen before. Their arrival didn't just add another species to the cast, it rewrote the script. The earliest hominins had already been experimenting with upright walking, free hands and larger brains. By 2 million years ago, with the appearance of Homo erectus, something remarkable had taken shape. These humans weren't just surviving on the savannas of Africa, they were making tools of stone, learning to control fire and beginning to spread beyond their birthplace. Their bodies were built for endurance, their brains capable of planning and cooperation, their hands precise and strong. They were not yet us, but they were clearly on the same path, a lineage that would carry human influence across the globe. The spread of early humans was astonishing in its speed. From Africa they moved into Eurasia, reaching the Middle East, India, China and Europe. By 1.5 million years ago they had colonized vast stretches of land, adapting to different climates and resources. Unlike many animals bound to narrow ranges, humans could adjust. They could craft new tools for hunting, gather plants in diverse environments, and work together in groups that shared knowledge and skill. This flexibility was their great advantage, one that allowed them to succeed in places that would have defeated other species. As the ice ages came and went, humans adapted again and again. Glacial periods forced them to develop clothing, shelters, and strategies for surviving cold. Interglacials gave them new opportunities in warmer, greener landscapes. Hunting large animals became part of their strategy, with spears and coordinated drives replacing claws and fangs. Scavenging gave way to active pursuit, and humans began to leave their mark on the populations of megafauna they encountered. Their presence was not overwhelming at first, but it was steady, a pressure that other animals had never faced before. By about 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had appeared. Our species carried the legacy of all the earlier hominins, but added something even more transformative: symbolic thought, complex language, and imagination. These traits allowed humans not only to adapt individually, but to accumulate knowledge across generations. A successful hunting technique, a useful tool design, a way to preserve food or navigate terrain. Each could be passed down, refined and built upon. Culture, rather than genetics alone, became the engine of adaptation. With it, humans could evolve on timescales far faster than biology allowed. The arrival of Homo sapiens across continents changed ecosystems in ways that are still being debated but are impossible to ignore. In Africa, where humans and large animals had evolved together for millions of years, the balance held longer. Megafauna there had time to adapt to human strategies, developing wariness and behaviours that allowed them to coexist. But in other regions, where animals had never known such predators, the impact was swift. In Australia, many of the giant marsupials disappeared soon after humans arrived more than 40,000 years ago. In the Americas, within a few thousand years of human entry, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and many others were gone. Whether through hunting, habitat changes, or a combination with climatic stress, human arrival often coincided with extinction. But humans didn't only remove, they also added. They used fire to shape landscapes, clearing forests, encouraging grasses and drawing game. They domesticated plants and animals, beginning the long process of agriculture. They spread seeds and species beyond their natural ranges, deliberately or accidentally. They built shelters, painted caves, carved tools and made art. Their presence was visible not just in fossils but in artifacts, layers of stone and bone and charcoal that told stories of ingenuity. The force humans represented was unlike anything that had come before. Other species had transformed environments. Beavers dammed rivers, termites built mounds, coral built reefs. But humans carried awareness and foresight into their actions. They could plan beyond the immediate. They could imagine outcomes. They could alter environments intentionally. Even in small bands of hunter-gatherers, that awareness made a difference. Over time, as their numbers grew and their technologies advanced, the difference became profound. The ice ages still pulsed on, glaciers advancing and retreating, climates swinging. But within those cycles, humans spread further, their presence a constant. In Europe, they lived alongside Neanderthals, another lineage of humans adapted to the cold. For thousands of years, the two species coexisted, sometimes competing, sometimes interbreeding, until only Homo sapiens remained. In Asia, humans encountered Denisovans, another mysterious lineage whose genetic traces still linger in modern populations. In every region, humans proved adaptable, blending with or replacing others, until the globe was filled with their presence. The arrival of humans in the late Cenozoic marked a turning point for the era itself. For tens of millions of years, climate and geology had been the main forces steering life. Now, a single species began to rival those forces. The extinction of megafauna, the spread of fire-shaped landscapes, the domestication of plants and animals, the building of settlements, all were signs of a new age dawning. The Cenozoic was still ongoing, but its narrative had shifted. Where once it had been the age of mammals, it was now, in many ways, becoming the age of humans. What makes this shift so striking is its speed. Evolution and climate usually work slowly over millions of years. Human change could unfold in thousands or even hundreds. Within a single lifetime, knowledge could transform how people lived, hunted, or travelled. Within a few generations, entire landscapes could be reshaped. That acceleration turned humans into a force as unpredictable as any asteroid or volcanic eruption, but one that lasted, multiplied, and carried forward. If you stood on a plain in Africa 100,000 years ago, you would see herds of antelope and elephants, lions stalking, vultures circling, and among them, small groups of humans moving with tools, fire, and plans. They would look frail compared to the beasts around them, yet their impact would ripple outward in ways the other animals could not anticipate. If you travelled to Europe 30,000 years ago, you would see humans in caves, painting walls with mammoths and bison, recording not just their world but their thoughts about it. If you crossed into the Americas 15,000 years ago, you would witness people spreading across vast landscapes, encountering creatures that had never known them before, and forever changing the balance. The story of humans arriving in the Cenozoic is not just the story of another animal adapting to the ice ages. It is the story of a new kind of force, one that could think, imagine, and act with intention. It is the story of how one lineage of primates, shaped by millions of years of forests, grasslands, and shifting climates, stepped onto the global stage and began to alter the trajectory of the entire planet. The Cenozoic had already seen forests rise, grasslands spread, ice expand, and megafauna flourish. But with humans the pace changed, and so did the scale. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that carried the imprint of all that came before but also pointed towards something entirely different. A world where the most powerful agent of change was no longer glaciers or volcanoes, but thought. In the vast timeline of the Cenozoic, 10,000 years is almost nothing. It's a flicker, a final breath at the end of an era that has stretched on for more than 66 million years. And yet, in that flicker, Earth has changed in ways that rival anything that came before. The glaciers that had advanced and retreated in their long cycles began to pull back one last time, leaving behind valleys, lakes, and soils that reshaped the surface of continents. The megafauna that had once roamed in such numbers were fading or gone, and humans, the late arrivals, were beginning to leave marks that went beyond hunting or fire, shaping the land itself in deliberate and lasting ways. The last 10,000 years, the Holocene, are sometimes described as Earth's most recent breath, a brief interlude of warmth between ice ages. But for us, it has been everything, the cradle of agriculture, civilization, and the world we now know. When the most recent ice age ended about 12,000 years ago, the world began to warm. Glaciers retreated northward, exposing land that had been buried for tens of thousands of years. In Europe, Scandinavia rose slowly out of the ice. In North America, ice sheets that had covered Canada and the northern United States melted back, leaving the Great Lakes behind as vast basins filled with water. Rivers surged with meltwater, carving new paths across the land. Sea levels rose, swallowing coastal plains and reconnecting seas that had been separated. What looked permanent during the Ice Age vanished in only a few thousand years, and the planet shifted into a new state. The animals that had survived the Ice Ages adjusted to the warming. Bison moved north, caribou followed shifting tundras, elephants remained in Africa and Asia but in reduced ranges. Some species, like reindeer and muskoxen, held on in the coldest places. Others retreated into smaller habitats, isolated relics of once greater populations. Humans had already played a part in reducing the numbers of many megafauna, and now the warming landscapes added new pressures. In many regions, the giants disappeared altogether, leaving humans to inherit a world where the largest animals were often those they themselves had domesticated. For humans, the end of the ice was an opening. For hundreds of thousands of years, people had lived as hunters and gatherers, moving with herds, following seasons, adapting to the constant shifts of glacial and interglacial worlds. Now, with climate stabilizing into something warmer and steadier, a new possibility emerged. People began to cultivate plants, first in small patches, then in larger fields. Wheat, barley, rice, maize, and countless other crops became foundations of subsistence. Animals too were domesticated. Dogs had been companions for much longer, but now sheep, goats, cattle, and horses became part of human lives not just as prey but as partners. Agriculture transformed everything. Where once humans had moved constantly, now they began to settle. Villages grew, then towns, then cities. Food surpluses allowed populations to expand, labour to specialise, and cultures to flourish. Within just a few thousand years, civilizations rose along the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River. Writing, trade, art, and architecture followed. All of it rested on the stability of a warm Holocene climate, a stability that allowed planting and harvesting to follow predictable patterns. For the first time, human survival was not solely tied to the chase or the gathering, but to the deliberate shaping of the land. The Holocene was not uniform everywhere. Regions experienced their own fluctuations, droughts, floods, and shifts in vegetation. But compared to the wild swings of the Ice Ages, it was calm. That calm gave humans the time and consistency to build. It also gave ecosystems the chance to settle into new forms. Forests regrew in Europe and North America where ice had retreated. Grasslands expanded in Africa, supporting the savannas that still teem with wildlife today. Wetlands and river valleys became fertile centres of life. In every case, the world that emerged was one reshaped by both natural processes and human hands. As human societies grew, so did their influence on the environment. Forests were cleared for farmland, irrigation systems redirected rivers, animals were bred and spread beyond their native ranges. Fire was used not only for hunting but for land management, shaping landscapes on purpose. In a geological blink, humans became a global force. They altered soil, water and air, creating changes that would last far beyond their lifetimes. This was no longer just a story of humans adapting to the Earth. It was a story of Earth adapting to humans. The last 10,000 years were also a time of migration and connection. As seas rose, the land bridge across Beringia disappeared, cutting off the path between Asia and North America. Islands became isolated. Continents took on their modern outlines. Humans crossed oceans, settling the Pacific Islands, reaching the Americas from north to south, spreading across Africa, Europe and Asia, until there was no major region left untouched. With them came their crops, their animals, and their ways of life. blending and colliding in countless forms. Climates continued their quiet influence. Periods of warmth allowed civilizations to thrive, while droughts brought collapse. The fall of cities, the movement of peoples, the rise and fall of empires, many were tied to subtle shifts in rainfall, river flow, or harvest success. The Holocene may have been stable compared to the Ice Ages, but it still carried its own rhythms, and humans learned, sometimes painfully, that they were not outside the reach of those rhythms. Through it all, the Earth itself continued its slow motions. Mountains still rose, though imperceptibly. Continents still drifted. Volcanoes erupted, sometimes with catastrophic effects on climate. The heartbeat of the planet did not stop, even as humans began to weave their own rapid pulse through it. In the grand scale of the Cenozoic, the Holocene was a brief breath, a moment of warmth between the cold cycles. But in that moment, everything familiar to us, farms, cities, writing, history itself, came into being. The Holocene also marks the beginning of what some call a new epoch, one defined by human influence. The Anthropocene is debated, but the idea is simple, that humans have altered the Earth so profoundly in the last few thousand years that the planet's trajectory itself has shifted. From greenhouse gases to mass extinctions to reshaping rivers and landscapes, the marks we leave are as clear as those of glaciers or volcanic eruptions. Whether the Anthropocene is official or not, its roots lie in the Holocene, in the moment humans began to move from participants in ecosystems to engineers of them. If you look back across the Cenozoic, the Holocene feels impossibly short, yet within it lies the entire story of human civilization. The rise of agriculture, the building of cities, the writing of history, the development of science and technology, all of it compressed into a thin layer of time. It is the last breath of the era, a breath that carries the weight of forests, grasslands, ice and megafauna that came before it. And it is a breath that reminds us how much can change in what seems like no time at all. To walk through a Holocene landscape at its dawn would have felt like stepping into a world both familiar and empty. Herds of animals still grazed, forests spread, rivers flowed, but the giants were gone, their absence leaving a strange silence. Humans were beginning to build villages, tend crops, domesticate herds. In the distance, smoke from a fire might rise, not from a lightning strike, but from deliberate burning. The world was settling into its modern form and humans were at its centre. The last 10,000 years have been Earth's recent breath, a pause between glaciations, a gift of warmth that allowed us to grow into what we are. It is not a final chapter. The Cenozoic continues, the ice may return, climates will shift again. But it is the chapter that holds our story most directly, the brief window in which the planet and our species align to create the world we know, a world born of ice and forests, grasslands and mountains, but reshaped in its final moments by human hands. When we look back across the Cenozoic, the span feels almost beyond comprehension. 66 million years ago, the world had just been struck by catastrophe. The dinosaurs, who had dominated for over 100 million years, were suddenly gone, and what remained was a planet emptied of its giants, its skies quieted, its forests burned. And yet, from that silence, new life emerged. Mammals, small and unassuming, crept out from the undergrowth and began to fill the spaces left behind. Birds soared higher, forests regrew, oceans swirled with new creatures, and the earth began again to write a story of abundance. From that moment until now, the Cenozoic has been an age of renewal, adaptation, and transformation, an age that carried us all the way to the present. It is easy to think of time as a straight road, but the Cenozoic shows it more as a series of waves, each crest building, breaking and receding. The Paleocene saw the rise of the first mammals venturing into unfamiliar roles, some awkward, some bold. The Eocene brought warmth so intense that crocodiles lived near the poles, and whales still walked on land before plunging fully into the seas. The Oligocene cooled the planet and scattered forests into fragments, encouraging the spread of grasslands. The Miocene was an era of flourishing, where apes diversified, horses galloped across continents, and whales filled the oceans with song. The Pliocene hinted at modernity, its animals resembling the ones we know, its climates shifting toward cooler cycles. Then the Pleistocene arrived, the long beat of the ice ages, sculpting landscapes and producing the giants of the megafauna. And finally, the Holocene, just a breath, where humans rose to prominence and began to shape the Earth in ways no other species had. Each wave was different, yet all flowed into one another, part of the same rhythm. The mountains we see today, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Rockies, the Alps, were all shaped or uplifted during this time, changing not just landscapes, but the climate of the entire planet. Their rise cooled the Earth, altered rainfall, created deserts and monsoons, and drove evolution in countless ways. The oceans too transformed, their currents shifting as continents drifted, their depths filled with new life. Ice expanded at the poles, carving valleys and fjords, dropping sea levels and then raising them again, pushing animals and plants to move, adapt, or vanish. The Cenozoic was a stage for constant change, a reminder that the Earth itself is never still. The animals that lived through these changes are both alien and familiar. Titano the herds lumbering across forests, whales still learning to swim, horses no bigger than terriers, birds taller than humans, chasing prey across plains. Saber-toothed cats leaping from cover, ground sloths pulling down trees with their claws, mammoths trudging through snow, and finally, humans standing upright, striking flint against stone, building fires against the cold. To imagine all of these creatures sharing the same long story is to see that the Cenozoic was not just one age, but many, layered upon one another. Yet each was part of a single unfolding, the journey of life across deep time. What makes reflection on this era powerful is that it has not ended. The Cenozoic continues even now. We are living in its latest chapter, its current moment. The Holocene may feel like a boundary, but it is only the most recent part of a longer continuity. The forests that cover our mountains, the whales that swim in our seas, the birds that migrate with the seasons, all of them are Cenozoic creatures, inheritors of adaptation shaped across tens of millions of years. Even we, with our cities and technologies, are Cenozoic animals, products of the same forces that guided every other lineage. But the difference now is that we are also shaping what comes next. For most of these Cenozoic, climate, geology and chance were the main drivers of change. Now humans have joined that list, altering landscapes on scales comparable to glaciers and volcanoes. We burn forests, dam rivers, move species across continents, release carbon that has been buried for millions of years. Our presence has blurred the line between natural and artificial, between what is part of the Earth's own cycles and what is part of ours. The reflection the Cenozoic offers is not just about what has been, but about what will be, and how much of that will be shaped by our choices. The age we inherit is both gift and responsibility. It is a gift because everything around us, the animals, the plants, the very climates we live in, is the product of this vast history. We are surrounded by survivors of extinctions, descendants of experiments, lineages refined through adversity. The oak tree outside, the bird on the branch, the cat curled on the windowsill, each is a success story from the long arc of the Cenozoic. They remind us that survival is never guaranteed, but possible with resilience and adaptation. It is a responsibility because we are now in a position to alter that arc. The megafauna that vanished in the last few thousand years remind us how fragile even giants can be when pressures change too quickly. The climate shifts of the past remind us that ecosystems are interconnected, that the loss of ice or the rise of mountains can ripple across the globe. We live in a time where our actions echo on similar scales, and the reflection we inherit is a mirror asking us what kind of age we will leave behind. The Cenozoic also teaches humility. For all the transformations, the extinctions, the upheavals, life has continued. Forests regrew after asteroid strikes. Oceans refilled with new creatures after old ones vanished. Grasslands spread when forests retreated. Ice came and went. Through it all, life endured, diversified, and found new ways to flourish. We are part of that endurance. Our presence is not separate from nature, but an extension of it, another chapter in the same story. The reflection we take from this era is that survival and change are inseparable, and that nothing we see today is permanent. If you could stand at the edge of time and look back across the Cenozoic, you would see a landscape constantly shifting, always in motion. A tropical Earth where palm trees grew near the poles, an icy Earth where glaciers covered half a continent, forests so dense they blotted out the sun, grasslands so vast they stretched for thousands of miles, herds of creatures, some tiny, some impossibly large, moving across them, and then, in the last fraction, humans stepping forward, carrying fire, tools, and imagination. It is a story not of one age, but of countless transformations, each flowing into the next. The age we inherit is not just a geological label. It is the living memory of all these changes. Every mountain, every river valley, every fossil, every living creature carries within it a piece of the Cenozoic. And so do we. To reflect on this age is to recognise that we are both its product and its stewards, shaped by it, and shaping it in return. The story does not end here. The Cenozoic breathes on, and the question is how we will breathe with it.